I'm ready. We're live. Okay, good. Then I'd like to call to order the November 12th, 2025 meeting of the Open Space Board of Trustees. First item is a roll call. So take a roll call.
I'm
Michelle?
here.
Yeah?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Michelle Estrada's here. Brady Robinson?
Here.
Okay. And online, we have John Carroll
Present.
and Sarah Glenn.
Here. I'm going
Yes.
to turn my video off for the rest of this call, but I am here.
You're welcome to do that, Sarah. We appreciate it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and I'm Harmon Zuckerman, so we have all five of us here tonight, a full quorum. So the next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. I'll start out by saying welcome back, Sam, and nice job. And does anybody have any comments on page 1 of the minutes? Nope.
Nope.
2?
No.
3? Okay.
Nope.
Question? No?
Mhm.
Okay, so then I'll take a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got to, let's take the motion from Michelle and second. Sarah, would you second it then?
Sure, I'll second. Yeah.
Okay, great. So take a vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, so we have 4 ayes to approve the October 8th minutes and an abstention from Brady who wasn't there. Okay, and now before we go any further, I'm going to turn it over to staff to read the rules of decorum.
Sorry. Apologies, it's just frozen. There we go. Okay. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and OSBT, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement processes, please visit this link. My computer is frozen today. There we go. The city will enforce the rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code. Participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. No attendee shall disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of any city meeting in a manner that obstructs the business of the meeting. This also includes failing to obey any lawful order of the presiding officer to leave the meeting room or refrain from addressing the board. Only one person at a time at the podium unless an accommodation like an interpreter is required. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No standing in or otherwise blocking the aisles in violation of the fire code or in a way that obstructs the vision or audio of other audience members. No signs or flags shall be permitted in council chambers except for one sign held by a person measuring no more than 11 by 17 inches, which is held no higher than the person's face. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. We ask that you not affix items to the podium or dais or walls or other surfaces of the chamber. Signs, flags, or other items used to communicate must be held by one person when displayed. Obscenity, other epithets based on race, gender, or religion, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the meeting will not be tolerated. In-person participants are asked to refrain from expressing support or disagreement verbally or with sounds such as applause or snapping, with the exception of declarations. Traditionally, support is shown through American Sign Language applause or jazz hands. If you are joining in person and would like to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing, please sign up at the table and we'll call you up to speak at the podium. If you're joining online, you can raise your hand to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing. You can do that using the raise hand icon or by clicking the participants icon, then the 3 dots on the bottom right and select raise hand. Okay.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so Tonight we have two public hearing items, and they're on your agenda as item 5 at 7 o'clock, which might start earlier. It's a recommendation from the Board City Council around the landmarking of the Wells House, and item 6, which is projected to start at 7:20 but might start earlier, which is a request that OSBT recommend an acquisition near the Boulder Reservoir. If you want to speak to either of those topics, you'll have time to speak to those topics after the presentations. If you want to speak to any other topic, now's your chance.
Okay, thank you. And we have two folks signed up for public comment. First is Paula Palmer, followed by Giles Troughton. Paula Palmer, if you're here, you can come up to the podium. And I'm not seeing Paula online either, so we can come back. Next will be Giles Troughton. You can come up to the podium. Oh, there we go.
Good evening, trustees. Giles Troughton from Boulder. I want to speak to 3 areas that I've mentioned before at the risk of being redundant. One is about fuel loads on OSMP land. OSMP has 47,000 acres. I don't think OSMP has standards to determine what the fuel load threshold acceptable tolerances are for the different types of land that they manage. I believe in the 2026 City Boulder plan, OSMP has got a target of 665 or 700 acres that they plan to mitigate. And the question I pose is, how do you know that's the right number of acreage that needs to be mitigated if you don't have standards to know when fuel loads exceed certain thresholds and you're not monitoring the acreage under your control to know if the fuel loads that you don't have been exceeded? My understanding is the 665 acres to plan for next year's mitigation is based on what happened last year in terms of the mitigation. That seems like a poor basis to establish going forward mitigation protocols. The second thing I want to talk about is high fire risk day access management restrictions on OSMP land. I've talked about this in the past. Don't know why it would be unreasonable to restrict access after sunset and before sunrise on OSMP land during high fire risk days. We've had several of those high fire risk days, even over the past few weeks. We're almost a month past our first snowfall in Boulder. We're entering the La Nina period, which for the Front Range typically means less snowfall and higher wind conditions. That was the exact same meteorological conditions that preceded the Marshall Fire. This is also the highest risk point in time during the year when vegetation is cured and grasses are cured. I completely understand the mission of OSMP to emphasize recreational access to our lands, but I don't know why restricting access during dark hours and sunset at 4:46 today between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning wouldn't be a good thing to do. I also think there's a ask for you guys to provide some input to the council about their retreat in 2026 priorities. I would encourage you to have council ask staff what it would take to make Boulder a wildfire safe community over the next 5, 7, 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Just going to check to see if we have Paula Palmer here or online. Okay, I'll move on to raised hands online. We do have a toward right relationship with Native peoples. If you could please identify yourself, I will allow you to unmute yourself now. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can. If you could please just identify yourself with your first and last name.
I'm Paula Palmer. I'm sorry, I hadn't changed my name on the screen.
Thank you.
And Paula, I heard who you're representing. This is Harmon speaking. And if you want to speak to the item around the landmarking of the Wells House, the right time to do that would be after the presentation. Otherwise, go right ahead.
Right. This is actually in regard to the report that you have as in the documents for this meeting, but that are not going to be open for public comment. This is about the Fort Chambers site and the very thorough summary that the Open Space Department provided of the community input, which they have gathered through physical meetings and also an online survey. It's worth reading all of that. It's many pages and it's worth reading all of that. It's a long list of lots and lots of ideas, lots and lots of opinions. And I want to just lift up one of them because it doesn't sort of rise to sort of a higher level of attention in the document. You know Fred Mesquita. He is the Southern Arapaho representative to the city of Boulder and the open space conversations about the development of the Fort Chambers site. Fred was at the gathering on September 22nd at the OSMP hub. And I was sitting at a table with him. And so I directly heard the suggestion that he made for the way that the fort itself should be or could be represented at the site. His idea is to construct a replica of the gate to the fort at the beginning of the path. So the way that the staff has defined this would be between the arrival zone where the parking, et cetera, is, and what they call the decompression zone, which is a long path. So Fred's idea is to construct this replica of the gate of the fort there at the beginning of this path so that we all walk through it. And if you can kind of picture what this would be like or sort of feel it, we would all be walking through that gate, entering the site, entering this history, becoming part of it, understanding that, in fact, we are part of this history and that this site is going to ask of us that we ask ourselves, what does this history mean to us as people of Boulder today? The idea was to build extensions of the walls on both sides of the gate, but the primary idea is for all of us to enter the site through the gate to the fort.
Thank you, Paula.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other members signed up or citizens signed up?
Okay, so we have 3 other hands right now. We have first Lynn Siegel, then Albert Nazander, and then Vinay. Lynn Siegel, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Lynn Siegel, I didn't vote for the open space tax, and I didn't vote for it for a good reason, I feel is a good reason. It's not that we don't need M&O and more money for open space. It's that we need to get out of our military. You know, we would have piles more money to be able to do that. And you need to advocate that we get divest from Gaza and Israel. And the other thing is the local developers that are driving the population in this town with high density projects that confine people to small spaces drives them out of their residences and for greater need for open space and mountain parks. And then we have even greater maintenance and operations and demands for more money to buy more open space to accommodate them. And I think what we need to do in Boulder is quantify the demand for services for each individual. All of the full embodied, full life cycle demands of one person and then figure out how many people we want to have here. Because otherwise there's no limit to it. And we have, housing crisis that is inelastic demand, because the more people that come, the more people and the more building we do to accommodate them, the more demand we have for the services, and we just keep on increasing and increasing. And it's not a finite amount of space we have here, unless you want to build this place into New York City. And my dad left New York City to get out of it. And the parallels now I'm seeing all over town. Have you ridden your bike through the Millennium now? There's no tennis courts there. I know that's Parks and Rec, but people want to get out and do stuff. Open space, same thing. They're getting less and less for more and more people. And I just don't think that's wise planning. I mean, I think it's pretty intuitive, and I feel bad, like almost like I'm preaching to you something that's obvious and that you already know. I think everyone knows this kind of thing. And I wish that you could somehow do something to enact policies that make it fairer for everyone, and also so that we aren't paying so much. That's why I voted against open space, because the developers can pay. Done.
Thanks, Lynn.
No, thank you. Okay, next we have Albert Nazander, followed by Vinay. And Albert, sorry about that. Albert, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Dear trustees, thank you for your service and the opportunity to speak. My name is Albert Nazander. I'm a paraglider pilot from Golden. I practice cross-country paragliding, where the idea is to take advantage of the thermals and cover long distances. Some of the popular flights in the area are to fly from Golden to Boulder and back, or sometimes go as far north as Wyoming or south of Colorado Springs. I'm here today to ask you to make a small policy change for allowing precautionary landings on Boulder open spaces for paragliders when safety it requires, similar to what neighboring Jefferson County open space has done. 2 weeks ago, I made a flight from Golden to Boulder and back. On my way back over El Dorado Springs, the conditions changed, so I had to find a place to land. I landed safely by Dowdy Draw Trailhead on a trail surrounded by open space with no people or animals in the vicinity. Immediately, I was approached by a ranger that issued me a citation. I scheduled a court date, which I'm planning to attend next week. I've flown in many places in the country, and even though Colorado is a leader in preserving public land, being stewards for outdoors recreation, we have many restrictions against use by pilots that don't exist in California, Utah, Washington, or Oregon. Unlike other recreational users such as hikers, bikers, or horseback riders, we actually carry a third-party liability insurance, even though our activities carry less risk than what a cyclist poses to a hiker or another user poses to a horseback rider. Altering park regulations to allow precautionary landings will not create a sudden change of behavior or will not lead to a large number of pilots landing in undesired areas. Decriminalizing precautionary landings will align open space rules with federal law, which clearly advocates pilot safety as the most important of any flight. Given that Colorado is the highest state in the country and the weather presents additional challenges, it's more challenging to fly over here. Pilots would appreciate the same emergency options that multitude of pilots outside of Colorado have available when flying under duress. The environmental impact of unintended outlandings does not accumulate strain, given that they are so rare and by nature, their own nature spread out. Thank you for considering this safety-focused improvement and helping keep Boulder skies and open spaces safe and welcoming for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Albert.
Okay. Next we have Vinay, and Vinay, you should be able to unmute yourself now, and if you could just identify yourself by your first and last name, please.
Thank you. This is Vinay Shah. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm the president of the Rocky Mountain Hang Gliding and Paragliding Association. Boulder OSMP lands provide our community with a treasured place for us to fly. Paragliding is, by very nature, a low-impact activity. We are nearly silent, we don't fly with engines, our landings are naturally dispersed, and our impact when we are on the ground is identical to that of hikers walking over the same land. Our sport has advanced in leaps and bounds in the past 2 decades. However, we continue to be regulated under a city manager rule that was implemented 22 years ago. This regulation, BRC 833G, states that launching and landing paragliders may only be done on explicitly approved areas. This rule was implemented in response to a pilot attempting to create a new launch area by cutting down more than a dozen trees on public land. The modern paragliding community considers this behavior to be abhorrent and not representative of who we are today. Furthermore, when the regulation was passed 22 years ago, cross-country paragliding was rarely, if ever, flown from Boulder. We feel that it is time to make a change to modernize these regulations to reflect the reality of flying today. Currently, the only approved landing area is in Foothills Community Park, and by criminalizing landings elsewhere on OSMP lands, paraglider pilots who are flying cross-country are under pressure to land in areas where they are unlikely to get caught by rangers, rather than by making the safest choice. As you've just heard from Albert, this is a real problem, and it does happen to people. The effect that this has is quite chilling. When pilots feel that if they land in a certain area, they will be approached by a ranger, issued a ticket, and required to make a mandatory court appearance, it greatly influences their decision-making in a way that we do not feel is appropriate. We've been working with OSMP for years to try to open additional areas for safe landings by getting them explicitly approved through the existing process. We appreciate the relationship that we have with OSMP staff. However, we have not made the headway that we would like to using this incremental approach. The most direct way to solve this problem would be to modernize these regulations to reflect the changes that have happened in the sport, but we are open to any process that will help us make headway on this issue in which we've been stalled for years. We would like to work with the OSMP board, staff, and the city government to update the regulations to promote safety in our sport while also preserving Boulder's natural resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and if you would like to speak online, you can raise your hand. We don't have any other hands.
Okay, great. With that, I'll close public comment. And we can turn to matters from the board. So I think first off, let's just see if there's any responses to public comment tonight. Nope.
Yeah.
Go for it, Brady.
So I want to just mention a few things on the paragliding front. And Dan, I understand you might have an update on that, which would be, I don't know if this is a probably appropriate time to talk about it. But so just as a reminder, we did discuss this in August of last year. And there had been 2 people who had written in with similar concerns. And we had a few action items from that. Dan, you discussed the possibility of refresher trainings for rangers, especially new hires, helping them distinguish between emergency and non-emergency landings. And then Lisa reminded us that there was a choice of evils clause in the Boulder Revised Code that already allows emergency landings to prevent imminent harm, but that the nuance hasn't consistently shown up in enforcement decisions. And it seems like it's still happening. So I think the rangers have just said, hey, we don't know what is and is not an emergency landing, so go to court and figure it out, which is really disruptive to people's lives. And I just don't think is in the public interest. And so maybe it comes down to the concept of an emergency versus precautionary landings, like some of the speakers said. I think an interesting analogy is, how does the FAA handle this? If you're flying an airplane and you declare an emergency, the FAA gives you a lot of leeway to do whatever the heck you need to do to get that thing down on the ground. And a FAA bureaucrat doesn't show up with a clipboard right afterwards issuing a citation or asking you if it was really an emergency. That's not how it happens. If it's egregious or reckless, you could get in trouble. But generally, once you declare an emergency, everybody gets the heck out of the way and does everything they can to support you, which is part of the reason why the FAA has been so successful in spite of a few kind of dramatic recent examples, generally so successful in managing accidents. And we discussed a little over a year ago, the chilling effect I think Albert mentioned about if you're dealing with either an emergency or just an unpleasant situation where you're coming out of the air in a place you don't want to, you shouldn't be thinking about getting a ticket in that case. So I completely agree with the speakers. And so, I think there's two possible points here. We could, give the rangers clear internal guidance that precautionary landings shouldn't be ticketed. I don't know, when in doubt, give a warning, ask questions. But again, pilots shouldn't be penalized for putting safety first. And then an updated policy language. And I think, Dan, that you got some update on that. But I do want to bring attention to, apparently Jeffco, Jefferson County Open Space, made a recent change to their recreation and activity management guide. And under number 30, it says Jefferson County Open Space does not provide or manage any landing site. However, any Jeffco properties may be used for landing in an emergency or precautionary preventative situations that avert hazardous outcomes. That seems like good language to me. And again, that's not my area of expertise, but I think there's people who could help us with that. But it does seem to me that the precautionary landing concept is good. And so in closing, I'll also remind you all of my illustrious 6-month paragliding career. And I never got past Mount Sanitas. I'm like a halfway decent athlete. I was trying hard. It's scary. Vinay is in Peru. He called in for Peru, and he's on these are world-class athletes that are occasionally dropping out of the sky on our open space lands. I think if the public complains, we've got a complaint or two. I don't think that's a huge problem, frankly. Like if somebody doesn't like, and I will say this, I will change as a board member, I will change my tune if we change the policy and all of a sudden we see people coming down into Chautauqua on the regular, and it's an actual problem, then yeah, let's take a look at it. But I just think let's remember that the people who are able to actually travel cross country have been working at their sport for years. It's in their interest to not abuse this. I think we can trust them. So let's do what we can to support them making good decisions and not send them to court every time they have to do that. So that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Brady. And Dan, I think you did have some responses to that.
Yeah, so staff has met since the incident with, I believe it's Albert's citation. And I've met with staff. Staff have been meeting with each other as well. And we are committing to reviewing the city manager rule to look at the concept of precautionary landings. I think that's the ultimate solution for what happened with Albert in that particular situation. And I think we can do that fairly expedited. We're going to want to assess the rule. We're going to want to see what Jefferson County did, what's working for them. Go ahead and come back to this board in Q1 and see if we can get something hammered out. So yeah, I think we're all in agreement that this 20-year-old wording needs to be updated, and we're committed to doing that.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Okay. Are there any other trustees that want to bring up a matter? Okay, then why don't we jump to any questions or comments on the written items? We had 2 written information items. Does anybody have any comments or questions around written information item A, the Fort Chambers Poor Farm Interpretive Experience report that we received in the packet? Oh, Michelle.
I just wanted to thank staff for the update and all of the work that you're doing to collect public input in ways that reach people where they are. And I found, yeah, so many of those comments really beautiful. People are really speaking from the heart, and also what Paula also reinforced in her comment earlier. I thought that was really wonderful. So that's all I want to say.
Any other comments?
I would second what Michelle said. I also really appreciated this report, and I know that the staff and all of us here on the Board of Trustees are really interested in being thoughtful and engaging, and looking at this and other projects, anything that we can do to commemorate our history and bring it here into the present moment. I know we're all committed to this. And so thank you, Paula, for your comments. And yeah, like Michelle said, thank you, staff, for putting all this together and your thoughtfulness.
Yeah, I'll just, oh, sorry, go ahead,
Go
John.
ahead. Yeah, I also really appreciated the packet. We talk a lot about public engagement, but reading this particular memo, reading kind of the comments and thoughts from the community, it really made it feel like we were you know, engaging the community, getting input from them, and really taking it into consideration as we're thinking about this. So it was a really well done memo. I enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, so I'll just echo everything or I won't echo, I'll just support everything that was already said by my fellow trustees, especially what you said, Michelle, about the way you perceived the process. But I also want to add that I thought that there was a lot of creativity involved in it. And it's really nice to see staff in the community getting together and really creatively imagining a site that doesn't, you know, lend itself to what's being created. It's not demanding. Like if you look at Red Rocks, didn't take a genius to put an amphitheater in Red Rocks. It was already kind of like that. This is really coming out of whole cloth, and it's just in so many ways, to me at least. I think it's really impressive work, and I like to see the mapping as it's evolving. It's getting more detailed with each presentation. So thank you very much. Okay, and then Brady, nothing on that one. We'll move to the next. Okay, so the next written piece was on the hub office lease and the facility strategy update. Any thoughts, questions about that?
Yeah, this is the one. I just think about I know you're going to save a lot of money by doing this short-term move, but just having moved last year, I just feel like I have a little PTSD around moving. But like, what is the disruption to your workflow going to be like to save this money for 2 years? And is it worth it? Like just packing up and moving and setting up shop in a new temporary location and then moving again, packing up and moving again.
Mhm.
I just would like.
Yeah, well, hopefully it's minimal. The good news is the building we selected is move-in ready. So a number of the other sites that we were considering required a build out, which you can imagine if you're staying for 2-3 years at the most, putting money in any kind of build out is hard to swallow. This one is move-in ready per se, so all the desks, the chair, I mean, it's all there. So the moving isn't going to be nearly as disruptive as if you're having to bring everything with you and you have to move it out and then set it up again. So we have selected a site that sort of minimizes that impact. The other thing that we're able to do is we'll have an overlapping lease time in which we'll have both buildings. Not to go too much into the negotiation details, but the place that we'd be moving into, that would be at no cost for us, so we wouldn't be double paying. And so what that allows us to do is move in while we're still utilizing the existing space. So that overlap is also going to minimize staff disruption. And the third thing that we're doing is we've established all our senior managers are taking up the task of from a culture change to getting ready what we need at the new site. And so that group is already meeting, already coming up with ideas to not only minimize impact, but to take full advantage of the possibilities that come with moves, because there's some positivity to it. We know that well, ultimately a number of the people that will move to this site are going to be at the West City campus. We have an idea of what that site's going to be, so it's a chance for us to mimic some of the things we're going to see over at West Campus at this new site. So in a way, it's a little bit of a training ground for the ultimate move. Ideally, you're absolutely right. If the terms were acceptable from a financial standpoint, we would like to have stayed. It's just not the case. The amount of savings that would take place is too compelling, and the fact that we can minimize the disruption is something that's been top of mind. So, yeah, of course, any move is disruptive, but we're hoping to minimize it.
And I'm sorry I didn't catch this detail, but if there is a delay in the West Campus, will you be able to stay in this interim spot a little bit longer?
Yeah, the move into the West Campus isn't going to be, let's say, on August 1st of 2027. Suddenly you've got this line of all these city departments ready to move in. It's going to be a phased move in regardless of when it be. So when those doors first open, it'll be a phase moved in. And so we will have definitely enough overlap time where we're likely not going to be the first department in because we're going to be where we're at for a little bit, and which is probably a good thing too. But yeah, so we're building in enough time where we're not going to be out in the streets again. In fact, we have extension clauses built into this one for what if scenarios. What if things go off the rails at West City Campus? We feel like we're really protected for what we're negotiating right now.
Okay, well, good luck to you all. I only moved literally across the street, which was actually, I think, harder. I thought it was going to be easy. So you think it's going to be easy? I hope it's easy.
This means a lot of short trips with a lot of small boxes. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions? Okay. All right. Then I think we can move on to the next one, which is to do a little follow-up or reflections on our retreat. Probably like to keep this relatively short unless anybody has something burning. Sarah, John, anything?
Nothing burning.
I thought that the first half of the retreat was really beautiful, and enjoyed the space that we were in. And it was also, I thought the format was really nice to have a little bit more space to be conversational. That's my comment.
Well, Sarah, the second half was in a way even better. Sorry you had to miss it, but it was a really extraordinary afternoon. So thanks to everybody who helped put it on. We really appreciate it a lot. Oh yeah, go ahead, Brady.
No, it was great, and I mean, just the range of properties that we have within open space. I think I'll barely get my head wrapped around it by the time my term's up. In some ways, and I did hear from the two relevant members of the public a little bit of unhappiness about the sound. You already knew that, but there were two people who tried their darndest to participate in ways that they could publicly, and I apologize to both of them personally, and I'll just say on behalf of all of us, it was not our intention to make that hard, and so I'm it's admirable when someone wants to sit down virtually on a meeting like that, and I'm sorry it was hard for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I did reach out to one as well and offered our apologies, and that there'll be some things that we'll have up on the website. They're already there, of alternate recordings that we were trying to take on our personal computers. That's up. We'll also have meeting notes that will be part of the board packet in December. So some folks would be able to look at our notes as well. So yeah, but
Nice,
otherwise,
man. But otherwise it was fantastic, and I appreciate all the work that went into it. Thank you.
Indeed.
And thanks, staff, for wearing their Halloween costumes.
Oh, that was really incredible. That really was great. It was on Halloween. We had our retreat on Halloween. We went as board members. So, okay, last item for matters from the board. We are being asked to do a city council letter again this year. And so wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about some priorities for that. But I think the first order of business ought to be to elect a subcommittee, and then maybe I'll turn it over to the subcommittee to run this matter from the board. So are there any members of, we need two, are there any trustees who would be willing to be on a subcommittee to take input and help draft the letter, the annual letter to city council for their retreat? I'll take nominations.
I would be happy to.
Okay, anyone else?
What is the timing? When is that due?
It's due December 19th. So we're going to talk a little bit about it tonight. We'll have a chance to talk about it again on the November meeting, and hopefully we'll have a draft that can be circulated through Dan for comments and a final polish for December, and then it'll be turned into council.
Yeah,
Michelle,
I would,
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
I hear John, I hear you're interested, and I was going to say, I'm happy to do it unless somebody else really wants to step in. Um, but I did not help with the retreat planning, so I feel like I should step up for a subcommittee if I'm needed.
I'm also happy to volunteer, Sarah, but I would defer to you if you really would like to do it. But I would also I'm happy to pull my weight.
I'm happy to give it to you, Michelle.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
So
then, I don't know if we really need a vote. I think everybody's probably happy to have John and Michelle be the subcommittee. Okay, well, let's just put thumbs up. Okay, well, there is an actual vote, and we've elected you. So, uh, so Michelle and John, I can just say to give you a teeny bit of guidance that, and thank you, Heather, for putting this together. Um, we talked about meeting topics at the retreat and field trip topics. Um, so in a way, I think the meeting topics where we talked about um, high priority meeting topics could also be a good starting point for the subjects of the letter. And those were priority 7C, South Boulder Creek flood mitigation, and wildfire resilience. Those were the highest, most starred topics. And then top choices for field trips were South Boulder Creek flood mitigation, ag lands, um, mobility device accessibility hike, and changes to policy 7C. So I can forward you that email from Heather just so you have a reference. But why don't you take it from here since you're here, Michelle? No, and John, feel free to jump in with her.
yeah, so since this is a letter to council on what we want them to focus on in terms of open space issues, I think the best use of our effort is to get their attention on things that are outside of the business as usual. Like clearly we're working on lots of those things, but to get their attention on the things that they're not focusing on. So if we looked at it from that particular lens, the one that comes to top of mind is 7C, which I know is a strategic initiative for the whole city. But I think, in our September meeting, really focused on the need to address the South Boulder areas. And I would love for them to have that on their radar. That yes, we're looking at this whole project, but we feel that and that's what, and I'm putting words in our mouth, but I think it's on video, that we feel that some focused attention on the south part of our system is warranted. So if you're okay with that kind of general filter of things that are not business as usual and things that we really want them to know, that we want them to pay attention to. Does that sound like a reasonable starting point for us?
It sounds like a good filter. What do you think the process? I mean, I've got a few ideas, and I don't know if we talk about them now or if there's another process. Like, how do we go from here to having a finished letter?
Yeah, we have kind of a small window to do that.
Right.
And we have to do this in a public forum, right? So John and I can draft something, but we can't circulate it for any input until we have another meeting. Is that correct? Or can you do
Dan
it?
can do it.
Or Dan can do it?
I could circulate things in the meantime for awareness perspective. So like getting other ideas, if trustees want to email with ideas, I can make sure John and Michelle get those, for instance. If you have other topics for that. So there is some opportunity for information sharing between now and December.
What would you all think about, so it's November 12th, that we try to get you a draft by, I don't know, Thanksgiving time, and then we can circulate it through Dan, and then that will give us enough feedback, enough time for you to read it, and then formulate some thoughts and discuss it in our December meeting. Then we can do another quick turn after that. Is that enough time or enough
No, I think
iteration?
that's, for me, that would be fine. I think maybe we ought to also, people who aren't on the subcommittee also should, if they feel compelled, they can send Dan a note about what they think would be a priority for for the letter, and then those could be distributed to you guys, and you guys could work on your draft, and then the draft could come out in time for us to review before the December meetings at work.
I would also say that if something doesn't come to your mind right now, but if you have something on your mind now, we had 15
Well, yeah,
minutes
I
for
want to
tonight,
get
right? Yeah, so
yeah, no, I
bring it
want to
out
get to
now
that,
would
but
be the best, but-
we're just talking process here.
Yeah.
So does that
Mhm.
sound good? Okay, so but before we get to that, and you may end up with your item already getting mentioned tonight, are there other board members who want to add to the list of priorities? I'm kind of doing your job. Sorry, Michelle.
No, go for it.
John, did you want to pitch in, subcommittee man?
I think that's a great plan. If y'all have any written thoughts after this, send them to Dan kind of in the next week. And we can take them into consideration as we write the letter. I'm really happy to be on the subcommittee. I'm actually going to miss the December meeting, so this gives me a chance to have input into the letter. But I'm with Michelle, like things that are not part of our normal business process, things that are out of the ordinary. I think those are things of value to raise to city council in our letter, particularly, but open to anything.
I mean, if I may, two things that come to mind are the budget and cost allocation. I think we may not feel unanimously the same about that on the board, but I still feel I'm still concerned. And I think there's still some more, and there's, slightly new council now. So I think that being on their radar and just understanding how decisions in the city manager's office can impact our program. So that's one. And then I think, I don't know if this passes your threshold for the letter, Michelle, if it's like out of the ordinary, but there is interest in the community to take another look at the seasonality of lethal control of prairie dogs. And the reason that could be in the letter is it has been a point of contention within the community. And so, giving the council a heads up that that's something that's kind of, been bubbling in the background might be wise. So those are two things that come to mind.
Awesome. I took notes on both those.
Can I get actually, can we field other ideas, and then I'm gonna want to just get a sense for other people's support of the ideas that are coming up.
So I'm going to jump in. I think council gives different direction every year, and it's probably the mean, median, and mode is 3 items that you want them to consider, but it isn't always like that, and I don't think it's like that this year. At least I don't remember the email that we got from the council secretary being very clear about exactly how they wanted us to deliver the direction.
Yeah,
You remember, Dan?
it's a little unusual this year because of the elections. So there's 2 straight elections with council. So instead of everybody being on a 2-year term, it's staggered until everybody gets consistency. So this year, this iteration of council only be on for 1 year. So what they're looking for is priorities that can be accomplished within and by the time they meet at the retreat, say 11-month, 10-month term.
That's what it
So
was.
they're looking for, it's a little bit narrower, and they're
Yeah.
also just reminding boards and commissions that we're not selecting more than 10 for the whole city and ones that can be accomplished within our 10-month term together. So a little bit different than in years past where you have a 2-year
Yeah.
cycle with that same council.
So Michelle, I guess my comment is
That's good information.
yeah, I was looking
I'll
for
send
I was
this.
looking
I'll
for the
send this
letter.
out to the board again.
Yeah, thank you. I
Yep.
was looking for it in my emails and I just was not finding it in time. Thanks for jumping in and helping with that. I appreciate it. So, I guess when Michelle, you were talking about things that are out of the ordinary, I think of these as things that, are things that council can do. They're not, so many times boards seem to write to council about what their priorities are, but I think we ought to think about the things that the council can actually do. So I support council looking at cost allocation. I support council looking at wildfire resilience. The lethal control of the prairie dogs, the window for lethal control is something that's actually set through council. So I would support that. And then a 7C is certainly, in the master plan council's priorities. So I'm good with all 4 of those things. I don't see anything else that's right in my purview that I would support besides those four things. I like, and you could be super brief about it,
Mhm.
we want you to look at this, look at this, look at this, and look at this.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you.
Uh,
Sarah?
Yeah, I also support those 4 items. I think those are fantastic. On the fire resilience topic, specifically, what I would like for council to do is support and fund efforts that are tying together like across departmental city efforts for the broader fire resilience team, which Dan Burke is actually chairing, I believe, unless that's changed, and that we have members of several departments participating in. I know that that internal team is doing their very best to work sort of behind the scenes to communicate and then to send the signals out through each of the varying departments. I would like to see continued, I would like to see an elevated, coordinated effort that's a bit more visible and more support of, for example, getting our RAP program where we're providing incentives for those for people who live in the WUI zone, which just got changed in this past year. And now we have new regulations regarding landscaping to get the people that are inside the city, the residents, to be doing their part, to really support residents understanding their part, because that helps us here in open space. Um, and because we there's there's a big line there in the city, and I'd like to see more continuity and more communications and just more effort and intention by the city council, specifically put in that engagement piece and that visibility and continuing to really foster cross-departmental collaboration. And we've talked about metrics before, so that ties in. If we're just each measuring our own thing, it only means so much. It's like you're just looking at one little piece of the puzzle. But if we can continue to really support efforts to put it all together, I think that's going to be great. Similar on the ag side, I would really like for city council I think that there are some fun things that we've already been doing and plan to really do more of in terms of visibility and communications and community engagement on the ag side in 2026. And I encourage city council to keep their eye on that and to help us support with engagement there. Um, and then another, I don't know if we need to add this. I'm not attached, but it's a separate, we did just vote in the mental health tax, I believe, as a city. And I, I think that our between getting like the programs that we already have happening for youth on our ag lands, and then the programs we have happening for youth with junior rangers, and just generally speaking, the mental health components that we are serving by getting people outside and connection to nature and all the rewilding. And I mean, all of this, I would like for us to really be part, I would like for the city to, obviously they know that we're a part of it, but I'd like to lift that up in 2026 as we start to ideate on what we're going to be doing with this tax and how that all moves forward.
Okay, the last part, Sarah, let me just see if I understand it. You want us to lift up our part and contribution to the mental health. Are we getting any mental health taxes? That's not coming to us, right? Yeah.
I don't think it comes directly to us,
Okay.
does it? No.
Okay, but you just want them to be aware of OSMP's contribution to the community's mental health by having access to the open space lands?
Yeah, and I can write a little bit more about that in an email so that I don't take up too much time here. I can give more thoughts.
Okay.
But yeah, I think I want us to be we are part of that, and I want us to be part of that somehow. So I'll put more thought around it and send notes.
Okay. Yeah, and it would be really helpful if you can jot down your thoughts about the wildfire. I'm just not a fast enough typer to get all that, so I gave up.
No problem. I've got pages. I
Okay,
won't
you
send you
get
pages,
half a
but I'll
page.
send you over
You get
some
send me
bullet
half a
points.
page.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so you got one more?
Well, we'll just just entertain us for 30 seconds. One of the things we talked about towards the end of the meeting was, okay, if we have less money, maybe we should do less things. Like maybe we should be focused and, manage a little less agricultural lands or sell off a few properties that don't really serve our mission. And I don't know that we got anywhere to a point where we can give any specific examples to council, but I would love to send a message like that to council, that when you have budgetary constraints, you can choose to do fewer things. And I think that's something that this community, frankly, the city government needs to support the city government in getting focused and not just looking for new ways to raise revenues, which has been, I think, where a lot of the energy has been going. So again, it's just an idea. I don't know if that has space in this letter. I'd be open to anybody's comment.
Well, even if we deviate from the rule of three, probably 18 is not going to work.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the I guess my question about that is, we'd be asking city council to do less open space work, or
Are we
How-
telling them we might do less?
Yes,
in the
we're
next
gonna
year?
do less.
I don't agree with the do less mentality completely. I think we need to do more, maybe less budget allocate, more creative collaborations and finding ways to not just have everything expand from a budget standpoint. But so I think I'm open to it, but I want to wordsmith. I want to participate in wordsmithing that a little bit, because I'm not a let's just cut things. I personally don't. That's not my viewpoint on how to manage things. But
Yeah, I
yeah.
do. I'm sorry. I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I don't, maybe it's, I mean, I agree that we're all threes and maybe fours in this case. Let's do it. And I don't know if there's an opportunity at the bottom to just sort of mention a few things. I mean, I think the fact that we're thinking about selling off some of these residences, presumably council knows about that. I don't know. Maybe they, I mean, and it's, we could say, listen, the staff are considering selling off a few residences. And just as an example of the kind of proactive things that we can do to be more, I mean, the more proactive way to say it is we want to be more focused, and we want to make sure that our energy is going to the places that best serve the mission and the public good. And so maybe some mention of the staff's thinking about doing things like that might be a nice message to send to council. That's it. Thanks.
So
Okay, focused. I can go along with.
I'd just like to, make sure that we stick to the call of the question.
Yeah,
This is like, what is it that we're asking council to do to help us with our mission, right? So if it's, look, council, we're thinking about doing more with less. If we present you with an opportunity to sell off, some properties so that we don't have to manage as much ag and private property owners can do it, we'd like you to support that. Now that I think that actually answers the call of the question. But let's think about that. When we talk about wildfire, are we asking council to help interagency coordination so that OSMP, can most effectively deploy its firefighting resources or its mitigation resources or whatever? I'd just like to say that is how I'd love to see you drafting. You know, and when Dan sends the email out, you'll be able to read the prompt that council gave us and respond to that. So look, I think we ought to wrap it up.
Yeah.
I think you guys are going to be culling, you and John are going to be culling through
Yeah.
the input that
Yeah.
different trustees send to you. And I think all trustees, if you want something that you heard tonight to be in the letter, and you feel strongly about it, then send your own email to Dan with your list of topics that you want to see in the letter. And Michelle, what do you think the deadline for that one should be for trustee input?
I would say,
Do you want to do Wednesday? Like we
no
get a
later
week?
than the 19th, Wednesday, the 19th.
Yeah, so we get a week, then
Yeah.
you guys get a week,
Yep.
and then the draft comes out the Wednesday after Thanksgiving,
Yep.
and then we have a week to finalize it before the vote in
Yep.
December.
That works. So I'll thank you for trusting us.
Absolutely.
And then one thing is I'm a very literal person, so I'm going to read those instructions. And what I heard Dan say is city council is only going to pick 10 out of the whole city. And so to get their attention, I think brevity and like concise and definitely culling the list is going to be really important, because we are not going to get their attention with 10 things and they're going to from OSMP, OSBT. if they're only taking on 10 for the whole city, and the focus is this 1 year. But thank you for trusting us, and we'll take a shot at it.
Thanks for stepping up. Appreciate that.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to close out item 4 on the agenda, matters from the board, and I think we're 1 minute behind schedule, but it's turning over to you, Dan, for the next item, which is our first public hearing item.
Yeah, thank you. It's first public hearing, so just a heads up, Harmon, that we will need the hearing portion of this. So what we'll do is I'm going to have Jeff introduce the subject. You'll hear from staff, brief presentation. We'll get clarifying questions. Harmon, you'll bring in the public comment if there is anything, and then you'll have board deliberations after that. So for recommendation. So
good,
yeah,
thank
Jeff, if you want to kick us off and introduce the item.
Sure. Good evening, trustees. Jeff Haley, Deputy Director for Visitor Experience and Infrastructure. And yeah, this is somewhat of a unique item related to our historic structures. And so I just want to give a brief context, brief introduction. Actually, we just had the privilege of spending some time at the Weiser House during the retreat that we just talked about. And so you all got to see a bit of our, some of the unique program we have where we work on historic preservation, historic structures, cultural structures, and that sort of thing. So that's really what this evening is about, seeking a recommendation from you all to support an application for landmarking of a structure. This is also tied directly to the Fort Chambers Poor Farm project that we just discussed earlier this evening and you're very familiar with. Part of the implementation of that plan, that management plan and process that was done, and the board's been very involved in that. So yeah, I'll turn it over. We have a few staff here available to support this item. I think we only have about 20 minutes and it's intended to be brief, but we think it's helpful for you all to hear a little bit of the context. We have Frances Bolding, who's our Senior Manager for Recreation and Cultural Stewardship. Julie Johnson, who you all met recently at the retreat, is our Senior Program Manager for his historic or cultural stewardship. And then we actually have staff from Boulder County. The structure we're talking about obviously is in Boulder County. So Denise Grimm is a principal planner with historic preservation for Boulder County. So she's actually online remote to help support as well. So I'll turn it over to Julie and take it from there. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? I know these things are so sensitive. I'm always a little afraid of them. It's great to see you guys again. I had such a blast with y'all that couple of weeks ago on Halloween. That was really fun, and I always love talking about historic buildings. I promise to keep this really brief if you have questions, but you know how I can ramble on. So just do this, Harmon, if I get out of control, okay? Leah, you can, if you'd like to. So this evening, we're talking about specifically about landmarking properties, and in this specific case, the Wells House. The Weiser House where we met is on the National Register of Historic Places as well. And this house is on the National Register of Historic Places. Just a little tiny bit about this house. I call it the Wells House because that was the last family to live there. Mary Hummel Wells moved with her parents to the house in 1920. And she lived there until her death in 2016. She was 98. I know, she got married, raised a family, so that was really her house. If there are any ghosts in there, it's probably her. The house was built in 2 phases, interestingly enough. In the back of the house, you see this photo, we think is the original part of the house. That was built around 1875 by George Chambers. The really pretty Queen Anne Victorian porch and the look that you have that you see in the photo is actually built in 1897-98. So not as old, but still pretty old. A couple of fun facts real fast. The house has actually 4 floors. It has 7,131 square feet. And just so you know, it has always pretty much been in agricultural use. And Mary's father, Mr. Hummel, I forget his first name, but you'll see where the Poor Farm would have been to the right of the building. He demolished that in 1930. So the Poor Farm isn't actually there, but we have a number of remnants of it. the National Register designation, a lot of people get really excited about that, but it's actually strictly honorary and for record keeping. It affords no protection from alteration or demolition. Boulder County Historic Designation, however, affords some safeguards as well as flexibility with, or it may afford some flexibility with some building codes and other regulations. And we, as Jeff said, apparently my colleague from Boulder County, Denise Scrim, is online and she can help with, have any questions about that. Just real briefly, Leah, if you can next one, please. There you go. Yeah. So I know you've all have seen this, the site concept plan. So we're looking up in the left-hand corner at number 4. That's where the farm is. And so specifically, we're talking about the house and the outbuildings. And if you can read that very in the I guess lower right hand, that's where in the plan it was talked to be about the restoring the agricultural use of the property and also the Queen Anne house. So, Leah, you can, yeah, there you go. So what is historic landmarking? Basically, it is an official, oops, it's an official recognition of the properties because of the value of significance to history, culture, engineering. It can also be a specific person who is important. For instance, the Weiser House where y'all just were, that is registered because of architecture and because of Ricky Weiser's contribution to the community. Next one, please, Leah. So there are various levels of historic designation and landmark process, and I'll just go very briefly over those. The National Historic Landmark is the highest level of recognition, and that has federal protection. Boulder has 2. Chautauqua is a National Historic Landmark, and the Boulder County Courthouse is a brand new one. Oops. Then we have next the National Register of Historic Properties, and those are properties that are considered significant to the nation's history and worthy of preservation. That program is managed by the National Park Service, and it was authorized by the National Preservation Act of 1966. Designation is honorary and for record keeping. And again, as I said before, it affords no protection from alterations unless federal dollars are going to be used. Let's see. I think you're a little, yeah. That's okay. Perfect, right there. So I'm sure you all are aware that the city of Boulder has a number of historic designations within the city. Those are within the city boundaries. Most of our property, as you're aware, 98% of our property is within the county. And the Boulder County Historic Landmarks Program is what is dedicated to recognizing historic properties in unincorporated Boulder County. Okay, there you go, Leah. So what does it mean to be a Boulder County Historic Landmark? The property's importance is officially recognized and documented. The property is protected from inappropriate alterations and demolition through a process whereby changes are reviewed by the Boulder County Historic Preservation Planning and Historic Advisory Board. And demolition and other inappropriate alterations can be delayed and in some cases prevented. Although, as I understand it, the county has always been able to work with the property owners to find a solution that works for everybody. And Denise can tell you more about that if you'd like to know. So, next one, please. We'll get it together. By the time this is over with, Leah, we'll totally be in sync. So what does it not mean to be a Boulder County landmark? Because a lot of times I hear almost as many misunderstandings about what it doesn't mean than what it does mean. So the interiors are not that they're not a part of the purview of a Boulder County historic designation. So the structure can be upgraded, it can be remodeled, you can move some walls, you can do whatever you need to do to make that property work for you. For instance, traditional HVAC and the mechanical systems don't have to remain. You can get rid of the lead pipes, you can get rid of the old boiler system and get something more energy efficient. And that's what I've done in some of the properties that we have. Including some that are landmarked. Traditional use of the building does not need to stay the same. The building can be retrofit to suit the needs of the property owner. For instance, we have a barn that it's still going to be a barn, but it's a different kind of barn. It was a dairy barn. Now it's going to be a vegetable farm. Boulder County allowed for that retrofit so that we can use the barn. Okay, Leah, next one, please. So let's see. Why do we want to seek designation for the Wells property? And the next one, please. Yeah. The Wells House and the outbuildings are one of Boulder's most iconic historic sites. They stand as excellent examples of agricultural property, and the house is an excellent example of Queen Anne Victorian architecture. And they all have a strong degree of integrity. By landmarking, OSMP can protect the heritage of the people of the city and county of Boulder and provide educational opportunities. Landmark sites can be eligible for leniency with Boulder County building codes and other regulations, which may help OSMP implement the Fort Chambers Poor Farm Management Plan. And landmark properties are eligible for state historic funds. Next one, please, Leah, thanks. And some other reasons to landmark it. Landmarking the property would help us fulfill our charter goals of 176D and H and comply with the Boulder County Land Use Code Article 15. The 176D is a preservation of agricultural uses in land suitable for agricultural purposes. That's what in the Fort Chambers Poor Farm is proposed to be used for the house and also the outbuildings. And 176H is preservation of land for its aesthetic and recreational value and contribution to the quality of life in the community. And then there's the Boulder County Code Article 15, historic preservation. And also it's mentioned in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan that we will do what we can to designate historic properties. Next one, please. Thanks. And just in case you're one of the many people who have never been inside the house, I've been very privileged to be inside it a number of times. Just a couple of photos from the interior and why it is some of the reasons it's so special. The staircase is oak. It's absolutely exquisite. We're very fortunate that they didn't paint the woodwork in the house. It's absolutely gorgeous. I have a light fixture fetish, so I take a lot of pictures of light fixtures when I go to these houses, and this is one of the best that I've ever seen. And then also, who doesn't, thank you, Leah, who doesn't love a beautiful lilac tree? And that's out on the porch. It's an exquisite porch with a fabulous view. Okay, next one, please, Leah. And so that brings me to the staff, our recommendation and the discussion with you, the motion to recommend that the City Council support the OSP application for Boulder County landmark designation for the Wells House and its agricultural outbuildings at 3902 North 63rd Street in Boulder. Because this property meets the criteria and qualifications identified by Boulder County as outlined in this memorandum and related attachments. And then the next steps, just real quick, should you approve that we should send this to City Council, we will seek approval from the council, and then we'll work on the application and get it to the city managers as soon as we can. And that is the end of my presentation.
Okay, and Frances is just there for moral support, or she has nothing?
She's my support supervisor.
Oh, good. Okay.
My support advisor,
Support
as Dan
advisor.
says, yeah.
We're making up new words. We're making motions and recommendations.
That's okay.
It's a great night. Okay, so any questions? I want to give the board a chance to ask questions before we open it up for public comment. Michelle.
Yeah, I just have a clarifying question on the bullet point. That's what is not required of property owners when a property is landmarked. And it says that property owners are not required to retain the structure's traditional or mechanical system,
Correct.
but upgrades are encouraged, but they're also not required to meet current code. Is that also right? If I'm saying
You
that
know
in a
what? You'd
different
probably
way?
have to ask Denise that question. I hoping to get off gas entirely by 2030. So when I do a rehab, I do energy efficient and the Boulder County. That's a good question.
Why don't we let Denise is there? Hey, Denise, nice to
Hi,
see you.
good to see you, Harmon. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for pitching in. I think you probably have an answer to Michelle's question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as far as the county is concerned, with historic properties, we do have some leeway if they're designated landmarks. We can work with our chief building official to allow flexibility in the code. So if it would be difficult to meet the full requirements of our energy efficiency codes today, we can, come to a compromise. And so that's generally a fairly easy thing to, sit down and have a conversation between the building official, the historic preservation staff, and the applicant and come up with, something that, hopefully improves the energy efficiency of the project, but maybe it just can't quite get there because we want to retain some of the historic features of the building. We don't want to, always change out the windows or something like that. And so it does afford some flexibility there that other properties don't have the ability to do.
Thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Anything else? No? Ready? Anybody online? John, Sarah, have any questions for staff, either of the county or the city?
No, thank you.
Nope, no questions. Thank you for the presentation and the packet. And I also have appreciation for light fixtures. You did a great job at the house we were at.
Oh, the George Nelson replicas. Yep, those are
Harmon,
fun.
I have one question.
Brady.
I got one question. Is there any reason potentially why this would be a bad idea? And is there any counter argument at all?
Oh, sure. I think people get worried about encumbrances and we can't do this, we can't do that, but landmarking and the regulations are there for a reason. I take it very seriously that I work for the people of the city of Boulder and this is their heritage. And I'd like to do what I personally can to make sure that it's preserved. I think Denise will, I've worked for a long time with Denise and a lot of times we've had to make changes to buildings, but we've always been able to work it out. But I think most people are just really afraid that they won't be able to do something, but we've always been able to find a solution. And like I said, I take it very seriously that I work for the people of the city of Boulder and that
Yeah.
these are their
Is
properties.
the building under threat right now? I mean, are we protecting it from a known threat or are we kind of future proofing it? What's the?
We're future proofing it. I think right now the house is in a really good position. We have a good staff. I've worked in historic preservation for a long time. I have a very good relationship with my friends at the county. I think right now it's in good shape. But you all are going to be replaced. Eventually we all will as well. So it's a future proofing kind of thing.
I'd maybe just jump in
Yeah.
that we consider landmarking really in line with our charter and our mission for protecting OSMP land. So even with the encumbrances, we see that as added protection, not limitations to what we can do with it as managers of open space. And to your second question, the property is somewhat at risk from vandalism at the
yeah.
moment. It's been a really significant challenge. So getting started on this rehab process and getting a current plan agricultural resident back into the property and use will really help. And we anticipate that landmarking it will actually make that process easier through some of the exemptions we may ask for on the property.
So once you get local landmark status, aren't there state grant funds that are available to help with the rehab?
Yes, there are.
Okay. And do you intend to apply for those?
Well, we did use a state grant to get the historic structures assessment. I'm not sure if we're going to go forward with the state historic fund grants. We haven't discussed that yet, but it's a
Okay.
possibility. I mean, it's something that we would be eligible for.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Anybody have any more questions for staff? Okay. Well, wow. Thank you guys so much. It's a beautiful presentation. Thanks for coming and being part of it, Denise. We really appreciate the county working with us
Yeah,
on this.
thanks, Denise.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay, open it up for public comment before we deliberate then.
Okay, we have one person signed up to speak right now, Tim Plass. If you're here, you may go up to the podium.
Good evening, trustees. My name
Good
is
evening.
Tim Plass, and it's good to see some familiar faces on the dais. Tonight I'm here speaking as the president of Historic Boulder, and I'm speaking for the organization tonight. And I am here to request that you follow staff's recommendation to recommend landmarking the Wells House and associated outbuildings. I don't usually get to OSMP meetings in this role, so I want to thank you for your stewardship of our open space as well. I'm probably out on open space 200 days a year, so I truly appreciate that. And obviously, from time to time, OSMP also acquires parcels with historic resources, as is the case with the Wells House. The Wells House isn't just any historic property, however. This is a top-tier historic resource. Historic Boulder has had a long-standing interest in the Wells House. The structure has merit for its architectural significance and retains its integrity to a high degree. The setting with its historic outbuildings also makes the site significant. In addition to the physical characteristics of the house and the outbuildings, the association with important historic events and people make it worthy of preservation as well. Obviously, there was the use as the Poor Farm, the association with Ms. Wells, and the Chambers family also. It's already on the National Register, which is a very high honor for a historic property. I urge you to recommend historic landmark designation at the county level as well. It's befitting such an important property. As outlined by Julie Johnson, there are important protections afforded through local designation as well as financial benefits. Being landmarked doesn't mean a structure is frozen in amber. It assures that changes will be compatible and complementary to the historic building. I would also highlight the language in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan that the city and county be leaders in preservation of their own historic resources. This is a chance to do that. So in closing, I respectfully request that you recommend the landmarking of this truly exceptional historic resource to council. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay. If you'd like to speak and you're joining us online, you can raise your hand. We don't have any other hands.
Okay. Then we'll close public comment on this and bring it back to the board. Any further discussion or a motion?
I'll just say that I found the information educational for me as somebody who doesn't know anything about landmarking, and so I appreciate all the effort that you put in there to explain it to people like me, and your presentation. I, for one, support this move after having studied this and also listening to you this evening. So yeah, I support it, and I'm happy to make a motion.
Yeah, I'll just say I support it too, and it's not a hard thing to support. You can definitely see that our staff wants to work with the county and wants to landmark this property and wants to preserve this property. All great things. Hope you can save it before somebody goes and vandalizes it some more, especially with those fragile light fixtures and the beautiful woodwork in there. It really deserves our attention. I have just a quick question for, and also an appreciation for the way that the report was written. And I like the other examples, especially useful to me were the examples of how landmarking has allowed some of our other historic properties flexibility that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And so I thought that those concrete examples really helped me understand better why it is that you want to landmark this property. So keep doing that. That's great practice in staff report writing. And then my little question was, in reading some of the things that have been allowed at the Hartnagel farm, what are high tunnels?
They're like, well, if you drive by and you see the little white loops,
Mm-hmm.
that's a high tunnel. It's a growing, it's kind of like a greenhouse. It's a
It's a hoop
greenhouse
house?
hybrid. Well, yeah, it's a hoop house. Yeah.
Okay, I just never
Yeah.
heard them
In
called high
Alaska,
tunnels
they call
before.
them high tunnels. So I
Okay.
probably, yeah, that was probably my fault.
Okay. That's good. All right, so they're hoop houses.
They're
Okay,
hoop
great.
houses, yeah.
So, anybody else have any thoughts about this?
Oh, and also the light fixtures,
Yeah.
I had an electrician take them down and they're stored in my
Thank you.
office
Awesome.
in tissue paper.
You have to give those
Oh.
back, you know, you have to give those
I have no
back.
idea where my office is going to be here soon. So, you know,
Apparently, the Resolute desk is now in Mar-a-Lago for
don't
refurbishing.
get
So
me started,
don't do that.
please.
All right. Not to be political. Anyway, Michelle, did you want to make a motion?
Yes, if we're ready for that.
Please.
I move to recommend that City Council support the OSMP application for a Boulder County landmark designation for the Wells House and agricultural outbuildings at 3902 North 63rd Street in Boulder. This property meets the criteria and qualifications identified by Boulder County as outlined in this memorandum and related attachments.
I'll go ahead and second that. And we'll do a roll call vote. Michelle?
Yes.
Brady?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
And I'll say yes. Recommendation passes 5-0.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the support advisor and to Julie. Mark, you coming up? All right, moving into our second public hearing tonight is we have an opportunity for a small acquisition, building out along some lands that are adjacent to open space and out by the Diagonal and Boulder Res. And to help us describe that property a little bit more, we're going to turn over to one of our senior property agents. I used to be in the work group and that was not my title.
Supervisor?
The property agent, yes, the new name, we give that to that. So Mark, you want to take it away? And just a reminder that this will be another public hearing item. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good evening, trustees. My name is Mark Paducci. I'm, as Dan said, senior property agent with Real Estate Services for OSMP. And I'm going to present our Gorse property open space acquisition this evening. Next slide, please. I'll read the agenda item. Request that the Open Space Board of Trustees recommend the acquisition of approximately 16.37 acres of land located directly adjacent to the Diagonal Highway and near the Boulder Reservoir for approximately $175,000 for open space purposes. Next slide. So this is a vicinity map, just showing the location of the Gorse property, kind of relative to the city of Boulder. Next slide, please. And this is the location map showing the Gorse property, which consists of the two triangular parcels that are outlined in red. Both the parcels are directly adjacent to the Diagonal Highway, property owned by the city. The properties that are shaded in green are managed by OSMP. And then the area that's shaded in purple includes land that's managed by our Parks and Recreation and Utilities departments, as well as the Boulder County Regional Fire Training Center. Next slide. Just a few details about the property. As I mentioned, it's comprised of two parcels. The south parcel is about 10.7 acres, and the north parcel is about 5.7 acres. The property is in unincorporated Boulder County and does have agricultural zoning. Gorse family has owned the property since the 1920s, and it was originally part of a larger ownership of irrigated agricultural land. OSMP's interest in acquiring this property goes back almost 30 years, and it's been sort of an on-again, off-again negotiation with members of the family. Next slide. So again, 2 parcels. This is the couple of photos of the south parcel. There are some wetlands and a little bit of riparian habitat on the south parcel, which is bisected by the boulder and white rock ditch. Next slide, please. So a couple of photos of the north parcel, the smaller one. And so I'll just mention OSMB staff, we're recommending this acquisition for a few reasons. As mentioned, the property is contiguous with other city-owned lands, including open space properties. And so acquiring this property will allow for better stewardship and management of the existing OSMP lands. The current owners have indicated that they do wish to sell the property now. And if the city does not acquire the property, they will attempt to sell the property on the open market. If the property were to be sold to a private buyer, there is some concern that the future access needs and the use of the property may not be compatible with the current uses of the adjacent city-owned land. Next slide. As part of our current purchase agreement, we will be doing standard due diligence items, which will include a survey, phase 1 environmental report, and title review. And last slide. No, that's okay. Just to wrap up, just thank you for considering this request, and be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Mark, thank you very much. Any questions from the board?
Are we seeing the use of this land as agricultural, or are we going to do more conservation there? What do we have an idea yet of the benefit?
It would be more of conservation and habitat. It's not currently being used for agricultural purposes. And so that's really not likely in the future.
Okay. And what are the grasslands there, and what is the habitat like currently? You mentioned some wetlands, but in terms of what do we have happening there?
Grasslands. I mean, it's like I said, not too much, I guess, vegetation on the north parcel. The south parcel again does have that boulder and white rock ditch, so there is some a little bit of wetland habitat and some riparian habitat on that south parcel.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I had one. You mentioned one of the reasons we were considering purchasing this land is because someone else buying it, maybe their use may be incompatible with the adjacent city-owned land. As far as I understand, that doesn't seem like a reason the open space department should be buying land, because the utilities department or parks department is worried about someone buying this land. If the city's concerned about that, why isn't the utilities department or the parks department considering acquiring this land?
Yeah, I mean, John, I think we mentioned that because I think that is one of the city benefits, but we have a pretty thorough process that we go through internally from our staff perspective of when we have an acquisition, and we wouldn't bring this forward if we felt it didn't have a significant open space reason for doing it. It does have other ancillary benefits, as you just mentioned, that it's adjacent to other city managed lands. But from the open space perspective, we felt it was important enough and to be quite honest, where we're at with the price and negotiations, we feel as we're at a really good spot with that. So we wouldn't have brought it forward if we didn't feel like it had open space value.
Okay. I mean, I trust staff's judgment here on that. I also think there's some, public safety issues on this particular area of the highway, and having that land not be bought by private buyers is valuable to keep it open space. So I'm generally supportive.
Michelle?
Yeah, thanks for that question, John, because I had that same question, like, why is open space buying it? Is it because we have more money or whatever, but that answers that question. And I mean, I did read about the prairie dog habitat and the red tailed hawk nest. Um, so I just understand the process. Oh, and hi, Bethany. We still miss you here. Uh, um, that when you have these negotiations and conversations with property owners, I mean, obviously these conversations are like years in the making, right? You're having these conversations over a long period of time, and you have your eyes on them for years. And my understanding is that it's not on the open market today, but if they were to go in the open market, you think that they would be able to fetch more money, and then they would be able to do things that we wouldn't want them to do with that property. So it's a proactive measure on our part. But so you feel like the price is in a good spot, and but they're not out trying to get other bids.
Yeah, they can you guys hear me? Sorry, my headphones are a little messy. Yes. Okay. Yeah, they actually did get an offer before, but wanted to work with us. And we're actually paying slightly less than what negotiations were way back in 1996, I believe. And it, arguably it is still developable. Again, they have an access issue of not being accessible from the highway, but state statute and other things would question that they might be able to fight for access through the reservoir property. And so again, avoiding kind of some of those issues. And it is what we would call kind of undevelopable or outlot value at $175,000 for this much acreage. To give you ballpark, per acre values in this area are probably closer to about $40,000 to $50,000 an acre. So we're getting a pretty good deal on this acreage. And again, it's in holdings. It is adjacent to open space, but yes, as you point out, it's also kind of part of this larger complex of parks and rec and utilities and fire training center and things like that. But it does have the alkaline meadow, the wetland, and riparian, and so again, pretty arguably, a good value and open space purposes on these properties.
Thanks, Bethany. Any other questions,
Sure.
Brady?
I mean, I guess you're hearing, this isn't exactly going to be the crown jewel of the system. And but it's conceivable someone Bethany could have built something here, like a McMansion, or I don't know, how's it zoned? Could it have been more commercial space? I'm sure Harmon knows this answer to this question.
They are zoned to agriculture, and so they could arguably have residence or agricultural structures on them.
Okay,
actually, yeah. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. Was one zoned differently? Was one not agriculture?
No, they're both agriculture.
Okay. Yeah. So they could still have residents. They could, and again, from a size standpoint, because they were downsized from a larger complex, and due to right of way and things like that, they could still be considered developable with some work with the county. So, again, we're making some of those fights and discussions potentially go away by acquiring them. Yep.
And it'll be closed for 5 years. Would the public ever, would this be some place that people would ever want to visit? Would there ever be any kind of recreational facilities on this? Like, what's the long term, or it's just kind of preventing bad things from happening, and then we sit on it forever? Like, what's this plan?
Yeah, so typically, and I recognize this board hasn't acquired property, and so we do typically close for approximately 5 years. So we do have a city manager rule that any new property is closed until a management plan or management planning is undertaken. And so because that hasn't occurred for these parcels, and we typically do that after acquisition, we say they're closed to the public. Now, the rest of the reservoir complex is obviously open, or a majority of it is open to the public. Will people be specifically wandering over to these parcels? even if we did open that, open them sooner to the public, likely not, other than just a interest of walking around the reservoir or walking off of the fire training center property or things like that. And so we would, just like our adjacent open space, they would likely be integrated into that adjacent management that is kind of the overlap of open space and parks and rec and utilities kind of stuff out at the reservoir.
I guess, Brady, were you done with your questions there? I said, oh, okay. I'm thinking I do agree that this is a fantastic price. I mean, wow, just wow, for that number of acreage. I would, and it's still an immediate it's an immediate expense, and then a long term, if we're doing whatever we do with it, there is expense that we're incurring through the property. I would personally love to see, because it's low cost, I'd love to see it continue to be agricultural, and for us to be able to provide leases to farmers, and to kind of bake the low price that we're paying for it into some of those leases to make farm leases affordable, to continue to support and promote ag, especially right there. The recreational value, and even I mean, the conservation value is clear, but the recreational value, right so close to the highway, I'm pretty familiar with that spot right there. The fire station is beautiful there, and I mean, there's a lot happening, but it's not really that's not going to be a highly desirable recreation area. So if I were to say yes to this acquisition, what I would hope would happen with it is that it would become, that there would be some leasing that could happen there. It could actually become a money generator for our department, through agricultural leases, in a way that also, as I said, benefit the farmers, and that it not just become more property to manage with more expenses, even though it's inexpensive now. I guess that's my overall sentiment about it, but I could see approving it.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah.
Do you have a question? Because we're just asking questions before public comment.
Okay. Nope. I think my question was, as would we lease it? I guess that did turn into an opinion. Yes, I do have a question. Would we lease that land agriculturally? Is that something that could be feasible? I know we'd have to make a full plan, but.
Yeah, I think I just reiterate what Bethany was explaining. It's as soon as the acquisition is completed, we will look at everything in a much more deeper level, in terms of what would be the management designation on it, what would be the future uses of it, and we'll do a full sort of concept plan, if you will, for it. So that would be all post-acquisition. And we will certainly explore the agricultural potential of the property.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, can we open it up for public comment if there are any people signed up?
We don't have anyone signed up in person to speak. If you're joining us online and would like to speak, you can raise your hand. We don't have any hands.
Okay, I'll give them another sec. Nope.
No
Okay.
hands.
All right, then we'll close public comment and take it back to the board for deliberation. Sarah, do you want to finish your thought?
I already deliberated. I'm good.
Okay. Any other thoughts around this? I know I have some, but go ahead.
I mean, I'm just admittedly kind of lukewarm on it. And the idea that we would buy it and then figure out what we want to do with it just seems a little backwards. I mean, maybe that's just the culture that we're coming from, but it's cheap, it's adjacent, and then we'll take 5 years and figure out what we're going to do with it. I don't know. That's not a really compelling story to me about, and again, I don't mean to dismiss the fact that we've worked hard on this and apparently been looking at this since the 90s and before. So, I'm just a board member in my own little limited snapshot in time, but this is not blowing my hair back.
Yeah. So I'm gonna make my comment now because I think that's related to what you're saying, Brady. And it's not the kind of property that blows your hair back, and it probably won't even be feasible at its size for any kind of agricultural operation. It may just be the kind of property that doesn't cost the department anything in terms of management. It's just going to stay prairie, right? It's just grassland period. But when you look, so I'm looking for reasons why we should support this, and I went to our charter. And so, I think there's several different items in the charter that do support this. So, one is preservation of land for passive recreation, and people can walk around on it. Another, and that really, I'm sure, doesn't blow your hair back, but another one is um, uh, utilization of land for shaping the development of the city, limiting urban sprawl, and disciplining growth. And what Bethany's describing is, yeah, if these two lots, which are date back, according to the staff report, to the 1920s, they predate the lot size requirements of the state, and they're going to be buildable parcels. They're going to be building lot determinations from the county. Then, what would they have to do if, somebody can have 10 acres of land in Boulder County? You leave it on the market for long enough, somebody's going to come along and want to buy it. And then they're going to want to put a house on it. And then they're going to have to figure out access. And they can't put it onto the diagonal because it's a limited access highway. So they're going to have to go through other people's property. And so I think this, more than anything else, I think this acquisition, and especially at the price of $175,000, which I'm not saying it's a steal. I mean, it could be that the market value is $50,000 an acre, but if you put in the $300,000 in a legal fight that it's going to take to get access to these properties, they're actually only worth what we're paying for them. So I'm not saying we're ripping off this seller. It could easily be this is what the market would really bear, but I don't want to see these properties put out on the market. And the reason why is in section 176. E, utilization of land for shaping the development of the city, limiting urban sprawl, and disciplining growth. Michelle.
Thanks, Simon. That's
Yeah.
helpful.
Welcome. Did you have anything, Michelle?
Yeah, I guess I felt the same way as you, Brady. Like we're in a budget constrained environment, and yes, this is a good price, but like, do we really want it? Like, can somebody actually access this property? Okay, yeah, we're preventing an argument over a potential legal battle, but it doesn't seem that easy that somebody would be able to get access to it. Would be a pain for the department have to argue that. But yeah, I wasn't thinking that this was like a stellar acquisition, especially in, yeah, my almost 5 years here, we haven't done an acquisition actually. So maybe I just don't know how to do it, but I wasn't expecting it would be something as, unexciting as this.
Well,
So I could go either way. I guess I feel you make a good argument, Harmon, and I felt the same way as you, Brady.
we just bought thousands of acres of mineral rights. We've done an acquisition just in the last few months.
Yeah, I guess like in fee, like yeah, fee.
An exciting new piece,
Yeah,
a
I
new
mean,
jewel in the
rice is
crown.
one thing, but I
Yeah.
think this is our first time buying property in fee, I think, in my time.
Huh.
Maybe right.
Well, that's a
Did the
momentous day.
fact check me on that one. But anyway, I still feel like I go either way.
Okay. John, do you have any thoughts? I don't think I've heard from you on this yet.
I'm kind of aligned with everyone else. I wasn't super excited about this acquisition, but I also read over section 176, and I think it meets the standard there, particularly for E and F, like you called out, Harmon. I also know I drive by these plots of land every day on the way home on my commute, and that particular area is a very dangerous area. There's the turnoff for the fire facility, and cars are, getting over to get off, and it creates some dangerous situations. It's also the same area where Magnus was killed riding his bike. And the thought of having, these being purchased for private use and having more cars turn off there, in my mind, potentially creates a public safety issue and makes things worse. And that particular stretch of 36, and I beat this drum all the time, but the primary responsibility of government is public safety, and I think this meets that threshold as well. So I would be supportive of it.
Any other deliberation, thoughts, comments, arguments?
I guess, I mean, in out of context of anything else, I'm going to trust the staff. This is your job to do this stuff. And so I think my comments are just I'm here to represent the relative, the semi-informed public, I guess. And the idea that our de facto is to sit on it for 5 years, close it, and then figure out what we're going to do with it, just that does not play well. And I know that's probably how we've been doing things, but that's not a great answer. If I was to say, well, Brady, why did you vote for $175,000 in a budget constrained environment for a piece of property we don't know what we're going to do with, and it's going to be closed for 5 years? I'd want to have something a little bit more compelling to say. But after this discussion, I support it. But I also I just wanted to say that.
I'll just add, Brady, that some properties have stayed closed for over 20 years. And that has bothered me, that it just hasn't gone through the work plan or the work site plan and all all these things that have to happen. And when they were acquired, they the argument was passive recreation, and 2 decades later, people are still waiting for them to open it up. I don't think that the recreational value is high here, but I think that there are other reasons to acquire it. Yeah. And so I can support it.
I echo, I keep saying echo. I'm not actually echoing. I'm supporting what you guys just said, Brady and Michelle. Thank you. A motion?
I'm happy to make a motion.
Please do, John.
I'll move that the Open Space Board of Trustees recommends I think that's repeated there. Or am I reading that wrong? To recommend that the Open Space Board of Trustees recommend. Yeah, that is repeated.
You can just say, I move that.
I move that the Open Space Board of Trustees recommend the acquisition of approximately 16.37 acres of land located directly adjacent to the Diagonal Highway near the Boulder Reservoir for approximately $175,000 for open space purposes.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so we've got a motion on the floor from John Carroll, seconded by Brady. I'll take a roll call vote. Michelle?
Yes.
Brady?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Sarah?
I'm actually a no, and I'm a no, understanding that I'm the minority, so we'll still pass it, but I'm a no.
Okay. And if you want to explain your no more after the vote, I'll give you some time to do that. And I'll vote yes. So the motion carries 4-1. And that's that. Sarah, did you want any more time?
Sure. I think, I mean, I'm a yes person. You guys know me by now. So I'll just throw a curveball in here. I actually don't think that we should, even 175,000, I really don't think that we should be acquiring lands without having a better plan and knowing what we're going to do. And that kind of what we were talking about before. I do feel we don't need to go slashing programs, but I think we need to do more. We need a mentality of doing more with less. And I think this to me feels like an example where I just don't see how this is doing more with less. I see a low price, but I don't see how it's going to really do that much more for us and for our system. I as much as anyone love driving into Boulder and having clear views to the mountains, and I can see value in purchasing it. I just can't see enough value in voting yes for it, for this acquisition personally. So I wasn't driving a no vote. I wasn't in here actively arguing that, trying to persuade everyone in my direction. And I do appreciate the staff and understand that there's been a lot of time that's gone into this that I haven't been part of. But just my actual vote is just a no on this one.
Okay, thanks. I'll turn it back to Dan for matters from the department. We're 15 minutes behind schedule now, but
Thanks, Bethany. Thanks, Mark.
May I make a just quick
oh,
interjection?
you know what? Actually, why don't we just take a 5-minute break
that'd be
before
great.
we move on
Thank
to the
you.
next one? And Brady, if you want to.
Yeah, I've got a sick kid at home who's home alone, and I don't want to leave her home any longer. So I'm going to transition to online, after this. So I will be participating, but I'm going to be in the same space as my daughter.
Great. Thanks,
So
Brady.
don't speed on the way home just because I only gave you 5 minutes. Back in session. Oh, okay. Open Space Board meeting is back in session. Dan?
All right, we have two matters from the department tonight. Our first is a brief update and a continual update on our Flagstaff Corridor Operations and Management Project. I don't know how many touches we've had on the board with this one, but this will be our last of the year, and more of just an update on our implementation of some of the recommendations and strategies we've been bringing to you over the course of the last year. So Jeff's here to just give you a little bit of an update.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Again, Jeff Haley, Deputy Director of Visitor Experience and Infrastructure. And yeah, this is going to be just a very brief touch. We've got a few key updates we want to share before we get to the end of the year. And obviously next year we'll continue providing information. But just as we heard through public comment this evening, there's still concerns and thoughts and consideration that we have for the Flagstaff corridor. Certainly wildfire prevention, protection, as well as safety and those sorts of upgrades. So wanted to give some information. I also want to just thank the staff. It's been a busy season, a lot of work up there and a lot of kind of quick turnaround and timely things. So I won't go through all the names of our team, but you've met a lot of them, seen a lot of them over the months as we've been providing updates, and just want to really thank them for staying dedicated and persevering. You can go to the next slide. So first of all, you probably all saw the star as you came in this evening, and we did the ceremony actually yesterday evening. So that's a major milestone. We love to do that every year. Started back in 1947, so there's a long history of the star lighting, and certainly partnering with the Boulder Chamber. We had the event last evening. It was a wonderful show, and then obviously had the aurora after that, which kind of topped off the evening, which was really cool. But I did want to mention too, again, just in the spirit of wildfire prevention and just kind of staying as innovative as we can with our infrastructure, we also have an automated switch on the star now that actually has a wind measurement device on it. So we can turn the star on and off remotely from a phone even. And the measuring device is set to turn the star off anytime there's high wind. So certainly we turn it off during red flag warnings, high wind warnings during as forecasted by the National Weather Service, but it will also automatically turn off with the wind sensor, and adequate lighting, turning on and off to just, conserve energy, electricity, all those sorts of things. So the star is lit and will continue to be every evening until the first of the year. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned, we still have challenges up there. I mean, you hear the news, you see the reports, the headlines, the press releases. Most recently, we had a road rage incident where deputies were looking for motorcyclists that were on the corridor. Again, you all heard about our webcam or our trailhead cameras recently that we've installed up there, and that you can see the live feed. Some of that technology is helping us do all kinds of things, not only monitor usage and visitation, but crime prevention and that sort of thing. So we still have graffiti, we still have a lot of trash, vandalism of all kinds. So we're still dedicated and trying to do as best we can with the corridor and using infrastructure. We talked about the 3 E's: education, enforcement, and engineering, or infrastructure. So we're putting all those tools to work. Next slide. And then just kind of a summary recap. You're going to hear from our ranger team here in just a moment, but wanted to highlight again that we did have quite a bit of extra patrols throughout the summer. May through August, we had 135 total, more than 135 total hours of extra patrol. And we just appreciate the support and coordination with Boulder Police Department, the county sheriff's office, and certainly working alongside our rangers. And then I wanted to highlight, especially during the Boulder Star season, just to reinforce safety and resource protection of the ecology up there. We will still be offering some overtime to have some extra enforcement and patrols up there, again, just to ensure compliance and safety. Next slide. And so the big news, we've been talking about the Panorama Point trailhead area and the work we've done this year to try and reduce the nighttime illegal activities that are happening there. Obviously, we have the nighttime parking restrictions from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. And this summer, as you all know, we did a project where we've done a redesign of that Panorama Point trailhead to basically be able to close that at night at 9 p.m. And so that project is actually happening this week. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But again, this image shows kind of the plan from the aerial plan view of kind of having a one-way circulation through that trailhead area, parking improvements with signage and striping. We will have two gates, kind of an ingress and egress that we can close every evening to ensure no one's in there parking, and then some barricades and other things just to control nighttime use or prevent nighttime parking. Now, once again, the trails are open, the corridor is open. This is a county roadway. It's just the parking area is closed during those nighttime hours, so people can still hike to the area from the Flagstaff Trail or down below and that sort of thing. Just no parking. So we're going to pilot this again. We've talked about 26. Next year through 26, monitor, measure, see how it's working, see how it functions. Are we seeing a decrease in crime and the activities we don't want to see and those sorts of things? You can skip to the next slide. So this just shows some of the work that's happening. In fact, this is from today, I believe, the gates being installed. As you come up, you'll turn in to the right. It's a one-way directional kind of counterclockwise, basically, through the trailhead there. The gates will be closed and locked every evening. You can go to the next slide, Leah. There's just another view of the turning movements. Once you kind of come through the area, you can either turn right, continue up the road, or go back to the left, go downhill. But again, gates on both sides. Those temporary barricades that you see, we'll be using those currently to kind of help guide and direct traffic and cordon off the area. This next year as well, we'll be working on a more formal design to kind of consider what a permanent change to that area might look like. Again, this is a test to kind of adaptively manage and see how it functions. Next slide. And then this one just shows more specifically those gates, just our steel tube gates you see at most of our trailhead access areas and striping. I think that's you can go to the next one. So again, schedule this week, actually, as we speak, we're finishing that up with the gates, the fencing, the striping, and the signage. That variable message sign, that board that has the messages, that'll stay there. We deploy that and move that around occasionally. And then the nightly closure, we will actually be locking it Friday, this coming Friday, or 2 days from now, Friday evening. We're working with Colorado Security Services to do the opening and closing. We contract, the city as a whole uses them to do a lot of the restrooms, locking, unlocking, gates, and those sorts of things. So again, that'll allow more capacity for our rangers to kind of stay focused on other things. And these folks will be unlocking and locking the gates each evening and opening them up. You can see me there pointing to where I think the gates should go, but then nobody listens to me and they're just doing their own thing. So it's about how it goes. You can go to the next slide. So just a real quick update. I think in August, you all remember the climbing community really wrote a letter to the Board of Trustees. I think we had some conversation about climbing access specifically. That's another big thing we've been working on since August. We actually met with the BCC, FCC, Flatirons Climbing Council, Boulder Climbing Coalition at two key locations you see there, Crown Rock, which is one of our designated trailheads, and Contact Corner, which is just up the road where a lot of bouldering and climbing areas are. Those are two key access points up above this area that we're talking about. And in response to that work where they came to the board and has shared a lot, we wanted to say, hey, let's go out there, let's look around, let's get on the same page what you all are thinking. There's some very specific climbing formations they want to ensure that access is provided and sustained. And I think we're aligned on that. You can go to the next one. We hiked along. We had staff out there with community representatives looking specifically at the contact corner and then the cloud shadow climbing areas. You know, and their interests are just like ours. They want to reduce the undesignated trails, protect the resources in the area, discourage all the kind of braided social trails that are happening, and again, have safe designated access. So we looked through that, looked at some areas and thoughts about what we could do, and just wanted to convey to the board this evening that demonstrate that commitment to working to with the community to make sure we have shared goals and kind of approach this really where, you know, we're preventing the illegal activity, but also supporting and sustaining the recreation access that's allowed up there. You can go to the next one, Leah. So this is Crown Rock. It's a designated trailhead. We talked a lot about differences between designated and undesignated access points, trailheads. So I won't name everything, but it's a developed space. It has a restroom, kiosk, all those types of things. So we want to continue that. And we might see that we see more overnight parking in that area. Once we close things lower down, they may start moving up. So we're already starting to think about what would be a solution there to control nighttime parking and that sort of thing. So that's the reason we're kind of moving up the road, looking at those areas. The next one is Contact Corner, which is again an undesignated access point. When we talk about designated and undesignated, it's goes back to our West Trail study area and some of those plans that called for certain infrastructure. But again, this location has a trash can and bike racks and fee parking information, that sort of thing. So it functions a lot like a designated area. So we'd like to talk with the climbing community and see how we can consider some changes there or updates. If there's anything that looks at making that a more designated, we would go through an evaluation of that to understand what those impacts would be. You can go to the next one. So again, just a brief update. The big news, like I said, was we have formally installed the Panorama Point closure. The gates will be starting to lock every evening this Friday. It's a huge milestone we've been talking about for a while. And thanks to the staff for kind of pulling that together very quickly. All those things you can see are going to continue happening with enforcement, messaging, signage, communication. We'll also look at other closures of those informal pull-offs along the corridor. None of the ones like we talked about last time in August that we know are climbing access points. It's more of the ones that are just subtle, wide areas along the roadway where we see people starting to go. In 26, obviously, we'll be tracking and measuring a lot of the outcomes and the data from these improvements. And we want to start also looking at more detailed design and solutions for other parking and access areas along the corridor. And certainly be coming back to the board with regular updates, working with our community members and neighbors to kind of ensure that this is successful. So that's all we had for this evening. Like I said, just brief update. Wanted to give a thanks to the team and thanks for our community for patience and perseverance and helping out. So if there's any questions, I can answer those or take them back to the team, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks for the presentation. I know so many of the things you talked about have been on so many people's minds. And so it's great to get an update. It looks like Michelle is clamoring to ask you a question.
Yeah, good job in getting those gates installed this Friday, or being able to close them. So I just wanted to comment on your video about the Boulder Star.
boy.
I saw that show up in my feed this morning and I thought, I know that guy.
That poor guy.
And Boulder, so a good job. I just like that you're getting out there and you're getting in front of people in different ways and you're reminding everybody to stay away, observe up close, but from afar or something like that. And so anyway, good job.
Thank you.
And from a communication standpoint, I'm glad that you're partnering like that to get your message out.
Thank you.
And then you did say something about those movable fencing and you're seeing what can be done with them down the line. Can you elaborate? Can you tell me more about that? Right now they're blocking Panorama Point. How are you thinking? And once the gates are installed, how are you thinking about deploying them next?
Yeah. So first of all, the video, I actually want to thank the Boulder Chamber basically called up like one morning's like, hey, can you meet us out? We want to do this promo. And so it's really great that they're helping support that message with view the star from afar. So as silly as that, I think it's helpful to get on social media. So thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, and the temporary barricades, those metal barricades, currently they're at Halfway House, which is the next parking area, simply to kind of support closing and making sure we don't get a lot of visitors trying to go up to the star during that season. Those will be removed after the star lighting season, which, like I said, runs through January. The ones at Panorama Point, right now they're just blocking the whole area while we do the construction and improvements in there. But once the gate later this week, once everything is striped and done, they'll kind of move away and just basically direct the cars through that area, and the gates will just be there. So they'll, in other words, if you show up on Saturday morning, the gates will be open. Those barricades will not be preventing access by any. You can drive right in there just like you would do any day of the week. It's just at night the gates will be closed to prevent parking, and then those temporary barricades will be organized along basically the white stripes that you see on the roadway there. So does that?
Gotcha. So you're thinking, because I saw that it's pretty wide, so people could park and not it within the parking area, not throughout that loop, but they could park outside the gate
Mhm.
and before in that area right before the stripe. So I was wondering if you were going to move them so that they could prevent people from actually parking on the
Yeah.
dirt there. But
So it's a little tricky. The road is a county road,
mm,
and public road, and there is a kind of a prescriptive right of way that we have to maintain. And so it's basically to the edge of the pavement and just basically 5 feet from the striping along the roadway striping. So we can't pull the gates all the way right up to the road, to the pavement marking on the roadway. So just like anywhere along Flagstaff Road, at any given time, someone could just try to pull off as far as they can, maybe even block a lane of traffic. And that's just an enforcement issue where a sheriff deputy or a ranger or someone else could come up and try to discourage that. The Panorama Point, we're going to have those barricades as close to the road as we can to prevent someone just saying, oh, the gate's closed, I'm just going to pull off here for a second and go run over there and do it. It'll discourage that behavior. But again, motorists, drivers could pull over just for a second, but they would be blocking a lane of travel on the roadway. But our barricades will be set up to kind of really corral and funnel the vehicles, where you can only pull one in at a time. We move the gates just slightly off the roadway just in case someone pulls up. They can kind of pull off the road enough to see that the gate's closed. But only like maybe one car, maybe half a distance. So in other words, we'd hate for someone not to know and drive up the road and all of a sudden turn and run right into the gate. It's enough of a room where they can stop and then turn around and go back. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else from the board with questions? Sarah, John?
Yeah, quick question. For members of the public, if I get asked about this, where do I direct them? Is it, if they aren't here tonight or watching the YouTube video of your presentation, where will they find these updates and the progress you're making so I can point people there?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, Sarah, and thanks for mentioning that because we've been doing a lot of press outreach, certainly about the star lighting, but also about this project on our OSMP closures webpage, or even just Flagstaff Panorama Point. There's information on the webpage about the timing and sequencing, and I think between now and Friday we're going to send out more. Not I think, but we are going to send out more press and communication specifically about the enforcement of the nighttime closure. So yeah,
Great. Okay, wonderful.
You'll see information coming out, and I appreciate you asking about that.
Yeah, thank you for all of it. It's been really nice to see this progress happening. It looks the gates look great.
Yeah.
Great gates. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And again, it's as we heard, it's dry, it's windy, it's the winter. And we want to be cautious and make sure we're protecting and and doing the best we can. So that's really the goal. So, all right.
This was great to see. Really appreciate the department moving quickly on this and getting something in place to deal with this emergent issue.
Thanks, John. And yeah, and one of the big pieces for me on that was just talking to rangers and knowing what a burden it was to police the road overnight, and the fact that the county and the city got together and increased patrols from the sheriff's office and did some great interagency coordination. It was wonderful to hear about, and so many other good things going on. So thanks a lot for that presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Our final item tonight is a program update, and thought it was apropos to queue up Burton and Janelle for a Ranger program update while we're on the subject of the Flagstaff Gretchen Boulevard. One of our senior managers of our Ranger is actually very integral into the Flagstaff operation and management program. So just a little shout out to Gretchen as we talk about the Rangers here tonight. So Janelle, you're going to get things started?
Yep. So tonight, Ranger Senior Manager Burton Stoner is going to give a deeper dive into what the Ranger role entails, including a little bit more about the evolution of the Ranger program, as well as highlights from some upcoming initiatives for the Rangers. And as we're getting set up here, as you know, the Ranger discipline is very varied, and our staff are knowledgeable and equipped to handle anything that comes their way. And if you take a look at that first photo as they're getting things ready, we thought this was a great representation of that. We have former Ranger Dan Hammond. He's carefully guiding a calf back to its herd. So the Rangers truly never know what's going to come their way, but they're prepared and trained for whatever does, including tech things. There we go. So then, great. Yep, you're going to see in this presentation that it does take a special person to be a Ranger, and we're so proud of the team, and they work so hard to be able to serve the people and protect the land. And after Burton's presentation, Burton, myself, and then we have Ranger Maria Mayer here as well, and we're happy to answer any of your questions. So Burton, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Good evening, board. Really glad to be here with you. It's an honor to represent such a hardworking group of individuals and to do my best for them. So tonight we're going to take a deeper dive into the services functions, the evolution of the work group over the years and decades, and some of our future plans. And so as we go through this, just offer you up some questions that you want to keep in mind as we get to the end of the presentation, and you can query us and whatever things come to you that you'd like to learn more about that we didn't cover. So here's three examples for you to consider. And again, so we'll go over an overview, a bit of the history of the Ranger program, our services and functions, again, the evolution, trends, and data, and the future of our work group. And that is Jeff Jasper. So a bit of a tongue-in-cheek here on this slide, but I wanted to give you some different perspectives on how people view us, and you may have your own thoughts on these things as you may have seen us moving around the system. But really, we've maintained the generalist model over the last 50 years of service to the community. So kind of the Swiss Army knife analogy still holds, and we are well trained and equipped to fulfill all of the services in our mission. And we'll spend some time tonight talking through the changes in the amount of time we spend in each service area, really driven by, the combination of the specialization of other work groups in the department that take on different functions that perhaps Rangers were more involved in the past, as well as the current visitor demands as we are out on patrol. Yeah. So really, I'm going to try and rapid fire through some of the evolution from the very first national park, 1872, to really the city picking up the Chautauqua area as kind of the first purchase that would become open space mountain parks. think about individuals in the community that really helped in the beginning. Martin Parsons is one of the most famous, would be on Flagstaff on his horse, Spider. That's the photo that you see there on the left. Radios popped in. We'll cover some of the technological advances. That's really some of the trends that you probably noticed with Rangers. And of course, in 1967, that first dedicated sales tax for open space, and really Rangers became law enforcement officers in 1971, and that was the first full-time hire. Dick Lyman was the first full-time Ranger, first chief, and really that decision to have an armed presence in the natural areas, but the community really wanted it to be park rangers. So people that not only could enforce issues, but understand the biodiversity of the area. And so that's a model that we've maintained. Ann Wickman there on the right was Colorado's first female ranger, and really a founder of the canine program for search and rescue. And then the Mountain Parks Division of Parks and Recreation and the Department of Open Space merged in 2001 to become the group that we are today. And really in 2012 is when we really started seeing some of the other trends in technology. So that's when we acquired mobile computers in our trucks, which have all kinds of advantages for us on patrol. Some of the data that you'll see presented tonight is based on Raptor, which is a phone-based app that we use to gather information while we're out on patrol and track our movements. Body-worn cameras, we'll talk a bit more about that later. Additional software, CalTopo, again, we'll highlight that a little later on too and show you its advantages. And department bought some drones this year, and we'll be developing policy and practice around that, so for deployment and use in 2026. So, and the Rangers will specifically will be training in with the Boulder Police drone team for some specific law enforcement operations. So, as we talked about, there are 25 Ranger positions in the work group. You can see the list of them there on the left, and really they're set up and designed to cover two main shifts for patrol and management of those Rangers across the week. And you'll see a mix of posts, which are the peace officer standards, armed Rangers, and the limited commission Rangers who engage in code enforcement along with all of the other services of the work group. You'll see we're fortunate enough to have the support of 3 additional staff, obviously 3 main staff in the department. We're supported by obviously the entire department, but these folks help us with project management and tech support specifically. And you can see the budget that's been allocated to us to maintain our functions. So really, we did our best to try and distill all of the work that we do, and we put it into 4 categories. So our services are public safety and system presence, resource protection, emergency services, and education. So within those, we have 32 functions spread throughout those, and there's a lot of interrelatedness, and we'll talk more about that as we go through them. So specifically, this is our best guess based on data and our experiences in the field. And when we talk about resource protection, about 20% of our time, education, roughly 5%, and that's mostly actual delivery of programs, both in the field and in schools. Emergency services, when you think about search and rescue, medical, fire response, and the more significant law enforcement incidences. Public safety and system presence really covers all of the other things we do on patrol, including searching for campsites, and as well as just moving through the system, engaging with visitors and creating a welcoming environment, which is one of our main goals as we move along. In resource protection, you can think about things like taking care of vandalism and graffiti, wildlife protection, agricultural operations like cattle drives, and cows out, those kinds of things that we assist with. There we go. Again, a little more tongue in cheek. This is the older tech. This phone box still exists on Green Mountain. If you pull off at Realization Point and walk down the trail towards the Green Mountain Lodge, you'll see this little metal box. That was my field office phone for many years. No, it doesn't work anymore. But really, what we're highlighting here are over the last 3 years, the types of incidents that we talk about when you think about law, medical, fire, search and rescue, and the main and wildlife incidents. You can see the trends. They're pretty clear. Other than wildlife and fire, fire is much more cyclical. Wildlife tends to be pretty consistent, but you can see the other categories have all been increasing over the last 3 years in particular, and even before that. Yeah, we can break these down quite a bit further for you if you have other questions, but we just wanted to kind of highlight the main areas, and to say if you're quick with math, you'll notice that all of the numbers don't exactly add up, and that is because, again, the interrelatedness, and the reason that we stay as a generalist model is because a medical call can turn into a law enforcement situation that can turn into other things, and so as we deal with something, being able to manage an incident like that in all of those different aspects has been a critical part of who we are and how we work into the greater system, both for the city of Boulder as well as the county. So Rangers do face an increasing number and severity of law enforcement issues. We have a strong partnership with Boulder Police, Boulder Sheriff. We really all rely on each other to manage these calls. From car crashes to shots fired, we're seeing and experiencing more calls for help. And we are now trained and equipped to respond to mass casualty incidents, and this interdependence is critical for the city and county of Boulder. And so, again, those trends that we have had to adapt to and move to keep ourselves safe, to help the public stay safe. So, and body worn cameras is probably the most noticeable addition to our uniform, and so a lot of technological advancements to help keep the public safe, keep us safe. And really, it started as more simple cameras just to provide recordings of events and statements, searches, but the state law required all peace officers to have those in 2023, and so we moved to that model and continue to see a lot of great functionality with that tool. It really helps us learn about how we interact with people too, right? Like you can view, oh, I said what? Did I really say? That's not what I really meant to say. I wanted to say this. So it's a good training tool as well. And speaking of capturing law enforcement incidents, here's just a quick overview of our summons and overall contacts in 2025. The map represents, you can see that on the edge of the system at the trailheads and kind of closer in where the greater number of people are concentrated, you'll see more contacts. But you can see our presence scattered throughout the system along the entire, throughout the entire system. Just want to pull up the other numbers and really just thinking about how we're talking to people and what we're talking to them about, general park information and the rules and regulations, and then again how we move across the system both on bike, foot, and by vehicle. If you can see, can you see those numbers?
Do you mind quick interruptions? You wanted me to hold questions till the end?
I'm good in the middle.
Do the Rangers have a quick way of logging the type of interaction, like a phone app or something, so they don't have to go back to the office after work and write out all these reports?
They do. Yep. So it's a Esri product that again our RIS team custom fit for us, and so yes, we're indeed able to step after a summons or a contact. We're required to provide demographic information on our contacts to the state. That's a state law as well. And so when we step aside after a contact, then we can quickly enter those things, or we can do it when we get back to the office for the types of incidents. But when we start a hike, you hit a button, end your hike, hit the button, and so it tracks us throughout that.
Thank
you.
Yeah. Okay. Totally.
Great. For the summons, really just wanted to share the top violations. As you can imagine, the highest numbers are dog related. Dog management continues to be a critical issue for us to address out on the system. And so you can see the first couple of columns related to that. The third one is more about the tents, nets, and structures and things like that that aren't supposed to be on the system. As labeled as prohibited items, that's what that means. Smoking, obviously of huge concern to us, and then issues with alcohol and marijuana drive the other columns. So yeah, just a quick check on that. Really want to get into the services a bit more now. You think of us as firefighters, and indeed we still are trained in that way to help with fire suppression efforts. You know, there is more of an emphasis on safety related issues related to public evacuations, trail management control during fire events. And so that's kind of our primary initial start. And then if there's time and need, then we can move into the fire suppression aspect of it with the rest of the department wildfire team. And just wanted to show you, here's an example of use of our body cameras. This is the dinosaur fire.
All right, you're gonna go with Alec, okay? Yep, this is only 20 feet. It's good on the other side. Just take a big deep breath of fresh air and then go. You good, Hal? All right, man. This is the worst of it right here. Okay. Absolutely. You just take a big breath of fresh air. It's about 20 feet and you're good on the other side. Yeah, so that's called torching. When you get one tree that goes up, that's called single tree torching. Yep. And then if you get multiple, it's called group torching. Now if the fire just starts to travel up in the canopy like that, it's considered a crown fire. So that gives us pause, because once you got fire up that high, it could start traveling in the crown. And that's when the fire really starts to run.
The crowns of all the trees?
Yep. It looks like it's into some stuff pretty good up there. That's a lot of smoke.
I just love that Brandon can't help himself, that on his way out after evacuating, helping people, he's going to go into fire ecology and talk about fire behavior as well. So yeah. Did that. There we go. All right. Camping patrol does require a lot of vigilance and effort to maintain. And really every day we're off trail searching the system for campsites. Based on how many people we have in service that we can send out in pairs to do this work. And so, you know, it's this kind of patrol, it's been an emphasis for decades, honestly, but the time spent managing it has increased as well. So we're seeing greater use of the system in that way. And really it's been the genesis of the SAMPS cross city departmental team to work with the safe area concepts it's led to a lot of better information sharing across the department, as well as really getting services to those unhoused individuals in need. And so it's really pretty dramatic change, and it's been a big piece of what we do and how we do it. It's really, you know, rangers know many of these individuals by names, and they know their stories that those people have shared with us. And so really it is about relationship building. We work with people with empathy, anybody that we encounter. But as in those situations, we do really have to be prepared for whatever kind of erratic behavior we might get out of anybody. But yeah, so we do encounter people on their worst days, and so being prepared to manage that is a critical piece of what we do.
Bert, can I ask you a quick question about this? A couple of meetings ago, I asked whether since Boulder passed that law that said that they had to prioritize that moving encampments from schools and paths. Did you see an increase of people moving toward open space then at that point?
We have not seen, there was a little displacement at first, but it really seems to have not changed that much.
Okay, so it's been steady. This has just been an issue that you've been dealing with for a while.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
but
it's
not
kind
as-
of a nice, because of that coordination, everybody was aware of kind of what might happen. And so then we stepped up our patrol to prepare for those things. We also step up our patrol on red flag days as well, just to be a little more mindful of the potential for ignition sources. Yeah, in those areas. Yep. Rangers have a passion for patient care, and being first to the patient is really part of our mantra. Based on the growing number of incidents, Rangers now are also handling some incident command situations to assist Boulder County Emergency Services. And really, along with the emergency services, we have great partnerships with the Boulder Fire Rescue Group, and the Rocky Mountain Rescue Group, of course, has been a foundation of getting injured people out of the backcountry and to advanced life support care when they need it. So it does require additional time, though. When there's a growing number of calls, it takes more Rangers to manage a situation. And when we're asked to help manage incident command as well as patient care, it can add up. So just things for us to keep track of. Really also want to call out that depending on the month, anywhere between 40 and 60% of all search and rescue in Boulder County happens on open space. So we're a magnet. Things do happen. And so being prepared to deal with those things is a critical task for us. Here's some more technological advances, good old paper maps. We still have them, but really I want to highlight CalTopo is another phone-based app that all search and rescue units carry with them these days. And what you're seeing is a mapping effort of one of our rangers, Tabitha Minsky. And so what you end up with that's her track of movement on a search. And so we have real-time tracking of individual search teams and people as they move through an incident. So it really helps the management of coordination of those events. You can drop pins and label things, and it's pretty. It's a fundamental change to how we do search and rescue. But what's nice is we can also send, say somebody calls in and they're lost or injured. If they have a phone with them, we can send them a text. And actually then we have a direct point. We know exactly where they are. So we've been able to actually walk people out. They've been, a couple hundred yards off a trail and they just don't know it. And so we're able to actually literally talk to them on the phone, walk them out. And so it also saves time on occasion. So it's a great benefit. Well, one of my favorite parts is the education component. We are doing less of it than we used to in the past. Just one of those matters. Of course, we have a great education work group that we can rely on for the vast majority of it. But we really, focus more on our outreach events, roving interpretation, but we still continue to do programs as well. You probably might have seen some of the night sky programs that Spencer was doing up on beach property recently. Great things. So really, again, it was a community that said, hey, we want park rangers out in the natural areas, not other forms of law enforcement. And so really maintaining our natural skills, our understanding of the biodiversity, and the geography of the park system really is the core of who we are. And it's really, you ask any ranger now, and that's usually what you hear as part of the why of what they do. Well, nothing like a good moose call. So working with wildlife is one of the rewarding aspects of being a ranger. We do assist CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, with any number of calls. It brings challenges, and it does bring rare opportunities to get up close and personal to many large mammals. So in addition, while monitoring the raptor closures and the Flatirons, you might be fortunate enough to see a peregrine falcon with those fledglings. That's what you're seeing on the rock. It's kind of hard to see the wings spread out, but up on the rock. So pretty amazing. And so protecting species like this is, again, another critical component of what we do while we're out there on patrol. Well, social media has a huge role to play in telling the ranger story. And so I did want to just share this particular one with you. Yes, it's never too late. You can always apply. No, but just social media is a great tool, and we have a couple of rangers that are heavily involved with that really help tell a great story and work with others in the department to share our messaging. So really want to get to then just kind of the future org structure concepts. Really, we're developing, formalizing our relationship with the Boulder Police Department, creating a memorandum of understanding around most of the law enforcement features, functions. And then really we'll be looking at kind of the ratio of our fully commissioned staff and our limited commissioned staff, and seeing what that might look like in the future. And then really cultivating a one ranger citywide model. So we will be partnering with the Parks and Recreation Urban Rangers moving forward. So that's really kind of the big buckets of organizational change. So yeah, just wanted to leave it now. If you have any questions for us, do you know anything else you wanted to add? Okay.
Yeah, of course. John, Sarah, do you guys have any questions or comments for Burton?
Yeah, thank you for this presentation, Burton. I noticed one of your questions at the end was, what should rangers communicate more of at social media? And I think there's just a lot more that can be communicated. There always is. I notice sometimes, and I'm not sure where they're coming from, and I could be off on this, but I notice sometimes there are these posts with a list of the calls that come in. You're nodding your head. Am I on track? Are those?
You are. Yes, you're correct.
Okay. I have thought, because I am a social media strategist, I should just warn you. I have thought each one of those calls is fodder for an interesting post. I like the list menu concept is good, and I'd love to just engage the community more on what's happening, because it's so behind the scene. Like it's a lot of it is pretty invisible to the day-to-day person. And I do think it's exciting and interesting, and it's just like real life stuff that's actually happening in our city. So and I think it's a nice balance to some of what we do, a lot of good education and family centered content and all of that. So I think getting some of this more like hardcore ranger stuff, like I liked your music you had on there. Getting some of that in there too. It's nice. I think it's a good mix. One of the things, this is more of a comment. I noticed this when we were going through the budget process, and I'm feeling it again here as I see the numbers and kind of how we're allocating our time and just the overall sort of bottom line budget. I feel like we need more rangers in the system. I feel like we need to be spending a greater percentage of our overall budget at OSMP towards the ranger program. These are jobs in the community. This builds safety for our community, and also builds resilience and maintains our infrastructure when we have spare time. So I think that yeah, and the education piece, I love that we're going strong on that. And I do recognize that you're utilizing every one of those rangers to the fullest potential and to the best of their capacity. And I really commend you for that. But I did feel this when we were doing the budgeting, and I'll just say it again here after seeing the presentation. I feel like this is one of the most important things that we do alongside, some of the, I think this is high on the list, and we should be funneling as many resources as we can to getting as many people out there as we can.
Yeah, just a quick response if I could. So totally agree. And in fact, I think if you would look at our outreach education efforts, we have rangers, and then we have a dedicated outreach staff, and then we have a dedicated education staff. So think of those as the triangle, if you will. And we actually have a very specific ranger job description that is sort of to coordinate between all three of them. So we have a ranger specialist position that is their main responsibility, in addition to being a ranger, is to look at that education component and see, working with our outreach work group, which is not our ranger work group, and working with our education group and working with rangers, and to see how that synergy between the three could go a place. So that was a new position that we put in place, I believe, in 2021 and codified just last year. So
Fantastic.
Brady, did you have your hand up?
I do have a question. Thanks for the presentation. I get kind of a two-part question. One is, could you walk us through what happens when you come upon, or a ranger comes upon an encampment on OSMP lands, and what you can and can't do in that moment? And I think this is something that's been on the minds of our community, as well as human-caused wildfires. And I guess the second part of the question is, to the extent to which you are able to get out there and mitigate the possibility of human-caused wildfires, and what are the limiting factors for you there? Thank you.
Sure, Brady. So actually depends on where you are on the system. So for the bulk of the areas, we have to follow that 72-hour rule. So we will contact individuals in an encampment. We'll let them know that they have 72 hours to move all of their gear. They may still receive a summons at that time for any resource damage, those kinds of things that we see. If they're in an HCA, more protected area, they have a 24-hour limit to it. And on red flag days or high fire danger, they need to move immediately. And so we can move people along, give them, offer other alternatives. But that's kind of the sequence that we have. And that recent change for fire risk, fire danger indice based on that is something that the SAMPS team put in place, and Maria helped put that one in place with the team along with the city prosecutor. So a lot of great coordination.
So Burton, if we could just follow up with, so the hours of 72, 24 or emergency is actually taking possession of or removing the encampment equipment, such
That's
as a
correct.
tent. If there's an active fire,
Yes.
campfire,
Right.
that is done immediately.
That's done.
Yeah.
That's dealt with immediately.
But if I'm to understand, if you make contact with someone on HCA, they have 24 hours basically without consequence to remain in place before we can force them to leave.
Yes.
And so what is that second
Maria, do you want to?
contact look? I'm sorry, I just, this is new to me, and I think
Sorry,
this
it's
is
a little
something
different.
that's
If the encampment, if there's no one there at the encampment, we put a notice up on that encampment to tell them that that's how long they have constitutionally to move their gear. Sorry.
Come on up.
the moving of the gear. Yeah.
Go ahead. This is Maria Mayer, one of our supervisors.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hey, Maria.
Yeah, it's the moving of the gear. They are told that they cannot camp there, or if they're smoking or they're maintaining a fire, that is dealt with immediately. So yeah, 72, 24, and 0, depending on what the circumstances and where it is.
And one follow-up question, thank you. There's been members of the public who have suggested closures, closures for the general public on open space lands based on, fire risk or potentially time of day. Could you comment on the extent to which such a closure would have an impact or no impact on people who are camping illegally in open space lands?
That is a very difficult question to answer. Uh, a lot of the answer is related to how our system is set up, and the availability and the openness. There are, of course, we have trailheads and designated access points, those kinds of things. But the nature of our system is it is open, easily accessible at all times, and so putting something like that in effect as a rule or regulation might have an effect on some number of individuals that would be willing to follow something like that. But it's a huge logistical challenge to try and shut a system like ours.
It's very porous, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
as
thank
far
you.
as designated and undesignated, I think there's 113 designated sites, and then as far as undesignated sites, if I get on the system, there's dozens and dozens of those. So we're talking anywhere from 100 to 200 areas of how people access our system. My concern, Brady, would be the strain it would put on the rangers to enforce those closures and what we'd be taking them away from
Yeah.
in order to just try to enforce looking at upwards of 200 places of how you could access our system and how they would be used in that sort of enforcement arena and what they wouldn't be doing then.
Yeah, thanks. I just bring it up because it's been coming up in our public comment, and I just think if those of you who are on the ground don't see this as a viable means to mitigate the possibility of human-caused wildfire, then it's good to know. So thank you for your comments and your presentation, Brett.
John, do you have anything?
I did. In the packet, you mentioned you're working on a interdepartmental agreement with the Boulder Police Department that would strengthen your partnership. Uh, what what are your goals there, and what benefits do you see coming out of that?
Great question, John. So I'll try and keep this brief. We have been operating for a long time with an MOU. It's an agreement with the city manager because as it stands currently, we report directly to the city manager and are allied with the Boulder Police Department through a current MOU. With all of the increases risk liability around use of force and those kinds of issues that might come up, this will really streamline all the practices and record keeping and all those kinds of things related to law enforcement issues. And so it'll give us some better tools to work with, as well as just greater consistency and reduce liability for the city as a whole. Is really it. We are really the last agency or department in the state of Colorado that does not report directly to a police chief or a sheriff.
Oh, that's interesting. Um, uh, we have all kinds of interesting stuff going on in the open space department. Um, uh, do you have any plans to potentially, get more assistance from the Boulder Police Department, patrolling the Flagstaff corridor as part of the agreement, or do you feel like you're getting the support you need now from them doing that?
Yeah, I think there's going to be very direct, tangible results of a strengthened and reworked MOU. And then there's going to be some intangible that might not be specifically spoken. But I think the relationship is going to be enhanced in terms of policies, trainings, and then just overall day-to-day coordination on law enforcement elements. So that 25%, that's directly law enforcement of working closely with PD. I think some of the intangible or unspoken results is they're going to get to know us a lot better as well. And they're going to understand where our pinch points and our capacities or concerns are. So I think one of the results maybe is that we could see some enhanced cooperation on both sides. Flagstaff corridor is a perfect example. We already do when we're passing through the city going from point A to point B. If there's a law enforcement call and rangers are right there, they'll respond. So there's already a relationship where rangers are responding off of open space. And I could see a long-term result being is that we could get some more enhanced understanding about what the ranger world is within PD as well. So yeah, there'll be some very specific things outlined in terms of policies, procedures, consistency. But I think some of the better unspoken one is PD is going to understand our world a lot better than they do now.
I love it. I love to see us partnering more closely with Boulder PD and look forward to hearing about how that turns out in the future. Thanks, Burton.
You're welcome.
Hi, Burton. I have a question regarding sort of the evolution of the duties of a ranger and the mix that you currently have now, and how that compares to people who wanted to originally become a ranger. And also how it impacts recruiting. I saw your recruiting video. It's cute, very cute. But how it impacts recruiting, because we have this whole extensive arm that's charged with education and outreach and and it kind of takes some of the fun parts of being a ranger out of your court, because just by necessity you've become more law enforcement. Like, so I mean, so how does that really like feel to be a ranger today, knowing that, oh, I want have a job description. I originally wanted to, here in Boulder, but here's a job description somewhere else to be a ranger. That's a totally different job, it feels like. And does that impact recruiting? Does it impact morale? I mean, what the things I do like, I do want to answer that. I want you to answer that question. But what I like about you all is that you bring so much humor. I mean, and you specifically bring so much humor. And I don't know if it's the culture of this department or this community, but yeah, like on this last page, you're obviously dressed as a bat, and
I have been known. Yes.
it makes you more approachable, given now that you're wearing, firearms and cameras, and just makes you more approachable. So I'd like that you do that, and I think it's very special. But back to that earlier part of this question is like, how does it impact just wanting to be a ranger and recruitment and compare, because the job here in Boulder is just so different.
It has changed, right? I've been here over 3 decades now, from when I started as a seasonal ranger. And yeah, how I spent my time when I first started, first couple of years, was very different than where we are now. But fundamentally, all of the pieces of the job are still here. And so it's just about a number, how our time is spent, but those fundamental core things really haven't changed. And so in order to be a good naturalist, you have to be able, whether it's you give 5 programs or 20, you still have to know how to do that, right? And so learning about the plants and animals that are here and being able to interpret those things as you move around the system, like those things don't change. And so a lot of it has to do with finding the right people for this job. It is a unique person that can tolerate those extremes of goofy humor and the ultimate most serious law enforcement situation you can imagine. We do that. And so to be able to transition across that spectrum, it does take finding unique people that want to stay. And when they find it, they love it, because it does fit them. And so So to your point, I don't know if that answers it, but really it's about how we talk to people. Like that is the bulk of our training is how we engage with people and how to help them become stewards of this land. You know, we know that we're only 20 people,
Yeah.
right? And we have to magnify that across everybody that comes.
Right. I mean, it was really obvious in that video where, I mean, I didn't catch his name, but what he was charged with was evacuating people. It was safety, right? But in the meanwhile, I'm going to talk your ear off about all this naturalist stuff. And it's like he wanted to get that out. Like he doesn't get that out very much. And like, oh, this is the time that I get to do it because this person's a captive audience and trying to get out of here. So I'm gonna like talk.
Captive, and it's a good distraction technique because everybody's really stressed at that moment too, right? Yeah.
I would also say that we've been very intentional over the last few years of looking at the full ranger team and is there career opportunities within the group? Because there's a lot of training and investment we put into an individual. And the last thing we want to see is the revolving door where we train somebody up and then they leave. So if you look at with the fact that we have management roles, we have support roles like administrative roles, and then within the ranger patrolling itself, we have limited commission and post, those fully commissioned. Limited commission spend probably more time on the trail. So, and so you could maybe find your career path within the ranger group as a whole. Like if you're satisfied at the limited commission role, we want that to be a place where you could, if you want to spend more time out on the trails, more time in the backcountry, perhaps it's that limited commission wing that most appeal to you. If you like that mix that's maybe a little bit more tilted to being prepared for everything, it probably would be a post ranger. If you love to supervise, you maybe want to work your way up to when you spend most of your time in front of a computer giving presentations to the board. So we're also looking at what that mix is so we can retain people over time too, because it's a heavy investment for us to bring on a ranger and all the training that goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, looking at your budget and the head count, I mean, the average compensation isn't that high, I would say, especially considering the housing prices here. So attracting people and retaining them must be really challenging.
It is.
And in such a critical role that our community needs. I have another question around the drones. I was just wondering if you could tell us more about your drone program.
Sure. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of the RAS team in the department is kind of driving how the drones will be used for natural resource management and those kinds of things. The ranger aspect is specifically really in two main areas, and that's specific law enforcement incidents that require some kind of additional visual ability to see, an armed person. Just call that out as an example that what type of thing that we would use. And then we are considering in flying in advance of high fire danger days, looking for thermal signatures that might be campfires and those kinds of things to reduce the risk. So that's kind of there's going to be a lot more use of the drones within the department once all of the policy and procedures are set. And all of the ecological concerns are considered in how and when we fly.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Great job on social media. Love the humor. Maybe do a little bit of training with Jeff over here and his videos so he can be a little funnier. I don't know.
Wow. Mic drop.
You get him going on the dad jokes. He does great. I don't know, Jeff, just wear a bat costume every once in a while in your videos.
Don't put me there.
No, but your the stats and the humor that come out on those, and when I read the monthly updates Janelle sends out, those are the best parts. Yeah.
I'll shout out to Jess and Lindsay on that one for us. Yeah.
Jeff, it's almost like she doesn't remember that you were Captain Jack Sparrow last week. I mean, I thought that was hilarious. So, I want to rehabilitate you here. All right. So Burton, thanks a lot. And
thanks,
I must have asked Michelle's question or talked about Michelle's concern about what rangers join for and then what they end up facing, a few other times in the course of my service on this board. And what changed for me tonight was the way you described this kind of Renaissance person who chooses to be a ranger in our system. You know, this, I think when I first heard about this was talking with Jeff Jasper and him describing the mix of law enforcement versus rangering kind of work that he did when he started, and then 20 years later, what it's like, and how it's shifted so much towards law enforcement. But it sounds to me like you establish the expectation with prospective rangers that this is the job now, and that you know this is a you're looking for the kind of person who wants to be handling, you know, some of these really tough things that police handle, other peace officers handle, and also have these other outlets: the humor, the hiking, the interpretation, the being of a naturalist. Um, so do you find, you know, and if I've caught that correctly, do you find that you're actually you've actually got a pretty stable staff that, you know, once you get them in here, they like the work, they're not overburdened by the law enforcement aspect of it, and they want to stay?
I think we're in a really good place right now. And we've, you know, through recruiting, through really the interviews, those kinds of things, right? We really tell that story as openly and honestly as we can, right? To set people up for success, that they really understand what they're getting into when they come here. Obviously, some people, when they actually encounter it and figure out that, yeah, this may not be the best example. And we have people that decide that, you know, I really love the fire aspect of it, so I'm going to go be a firefighter after a couple of years or 5 years or whatever, or I'm going to go be a deputy because I really like some other aspect, even more of the law enforcement than what we have. And so, yeah, there will always be some transition in and out. That's a natural trend of kind of the modern world of public safety groups, but I feel really good about the group that we have right now, and that I expect it to be pretty stable.
Well, I appreciate the clarity that you've given for what the real role of a Boulder Parks and Open Space and Mountain Parks employee ranger really is, and what they expect and what they deal with, and it helps me understand a lot better. And I also like the fact that you put it in historical context. You know, the notion that even 50 years ago, it was understood that the citizens of Boulder wanted an armed presence on the land, but like you've described, one that also knows how to be a naturalist, and I think that's a pretty admirable mix. So thanks for that. Thanks for keeping the flame burning.
It's an honor. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts before we wrap up? I don't want to cut anyone off. Thanks for everybody's input. Appreciate the presentation a lot. Thanks for coming and seeing us.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Burton, and big shout out to Janelle who helped put the
Yes.
presentation together.
Oh, yeah.
Behind the
Janelle.
scenes. So. Yeah, team effort. Thank you. Just want to.
Who are those names so we can get them in the microphone?
Yeah, Erin Bedison, who is our Ranger Program Manager and all projects manager, and then also Ranger Jessica Anderson. So they did a version of this presentation to all staff for OSMP all staff, and then we took bits and pieces of it and then we adapted it for tonight. So
thanks,
yeah.
Janelle, and thanks to them too.
Yeah. Just a few seconds of some director updates. Marshall Mesa Trailhead is really picking up speed. We're anticipating a completion date sometime in December. We have it down to come back to you in January to give some trailhead updates. And so we will update you on Marshall Mesa, but by the time we update you, it may be fully functioning and up and running. So good news on that front. Just want to let you know that those grant applications that you all recommended to council did move forward. And so the South Mesa Trailhead and the Foothills Trail were approved on consent by City Council. So that grant application is going to be heading out, and we'll keep you up to date on the status of that. So yeah, just a couple updates. Yeah.
Dan, you mentioned South Mesa. I was just there, and I saw a crew working in the trailhead. So is that project actually starting?
No, we have, based on the nature of we have a lot of annual and monthly maintenance projects that go on this is not related to the big improvement project that if we're funded through this grant, that would take place. That's going to result in a trail closure, a trailhead closure, and that would beyond just a sort of a maintenance project.
Yeah, this was mostly just putting gravel down and
Yep.
surfacing.
And that's one of the reasons why we need to do the bigger project is we're out there continually dumping material on, redumping, recontouring, just based on some characteristics of the trailhead just have to change.
Yeah.
And that would be the improvement project.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, is that it for the director's report?
That's it.
All right, then I'm going to gavel us out. Thanks, the meeting is adjourned.